It was an ordinary working day at the Imperial Bank. Visitors, as always, were very numerous. But towards the end of the working day, the crowd thinned out, and there were few customers. A girl of about 7 years old entered the premises. She was dressed very poorly. A shabby jacket with a broken zip, old trousers and stubby, obviously 2 big boots. In her hands, she held a green-colored children's pistol. The guard looked closely at the child and thought, "What's she doing out here? So small alone. Where are the parents? It seems a pity to kick her out. It's very cold outside. Let her warm herself." The child's face was serious beyond her years, and her eyes were crying. The girl confidently approached the window and pointed her toy gun at the cashier with the words, "Auntie, make me a millionaire. Give me some money. I really need it, or it'll be bad for everyone." And the child burst into tears. Helen, the cashier, had seen a lot of things over the years and thought that nothing would surprise her. But here even she was taken aback and did not know how to react, whether to cry or laugh at the ridiculous child's prank. According to the instructions, in any unclear or dangerous situation, the cashier is obliged to press the panic button and call the banker to the hall. The woman decided to do so just in case. Just in case. A few minutes later, Mr. Patterson came into the room and looked with surprise at the little girl with the gun, who continued to sob and smear tears on her cheeks. He asked Helen, "What happened? An emergency situation? What's the problem?" The woman replied with a smile, "Yes, this little thing wants money, asks for a loan, otherwise he threatens me with a gun. I realize that it's a toy, but just in case I decided to invite you." The man was stunned. But before he could even say a word, a panting old woman ran into the bank. She was also dressed poorly, but neatly. The old woman grabbed the little girl by the arm and wailed, "Anne, my dear, why did you go alone? I can't keep up with you. You've upset the people." Mr. Patterson was dumbfounded. "All right, dear citizen. Is this your granddaughter? What kind of a show are you putting on here? What a bunch of burglars. You can get punished for jokes like that. We're a serious organization. You need to keep a better eye on your child." Grandma just waved her hand. "How can we not organize it? A performance? We've already been refused credit by all the banks, so she got desperate. Her mother is dying, in a coma. She needs an emergency operation. They're asking a lot of money for it. What choice does the child have? What's the child's way out? She's the one with a heart. She's probably seen a lot of films and decided to take a desperate step. For God's sake, forgive her." Mr. Patterson took another stern look at the little girl. There was something about her that caught his eye, something about her that reminded him of someone else, but he couldn't make out who. The child folded her hands in the form of a prayer and, looking straight into his eyes, began to beg, "Uncle, lend us some money. Please, Mummy is dying. Just don't send us away. We have nowhere else to go with Grandma." Something twinged inside. The banker took pity. He waved them off. "All right, let's go to my office. We'll talk in detail." "Tell me, what's your story?" Mr. Patterson said. "We'll see what we can do." In the office, the old woman sighed and began to tell. "I haven't even introduced myself to you, Mr. Patterson. My name is Mrs. Caroline. You see, it's a long, complicated story. I'll just tell you the main thing. Anne's mom's name is Mary. She and her daughter rent a room from me. She's a good, decent, hard-working woman. She runs a bake shop. It was hard enough as it was, working 12 hours a day, as long as she had enough to live on and to take care of her kid. Then 2 months ago, Mary was coming home late at night, and a car hit her on a pedestrian crossing. And what's more, it drove off straight away. A dog walker called an ambulance. Well, she's in a coma. She needs emergency surgery. I've got all her diagnoses right here. I made copies. Here you go. Where can you get that kind of money? There's no one to help her, no relatives. She's like a daughter to me. Anne's like a granddaughter. My pension is a pittance. And I'm in my 80s. I feel sorry for Mary and Anne. I can't bear it. I mean, if she dies, they'll take the baby away to an orphanage. What kind of future does she have? It's a desperate situation. Please look at the paperwork. Maybe we can get a loan. Don't worry, Mary will recover. She'll work it all off. And even more, we'll pay it back together, little by little. A man can't die if he has no money after all." Mr. Patterson looked at his watch and said, "I've got it all figured out. I'll look at the papers at home tonight. I'll see what I can do to help. It's not my bank, so it's not just up to me. It's a really tough situation you're in. I'm sorry I have to go. Anne, don't be sad. Here's a chocolate bar. And he smilingly handed the little girl a large milk candy. The child took it timidly and said quietly, "Thank you. I believe you will help us. I don't want Mummy to die." The banker returned home to the posh mansion. Everything was unchanged. There was food from the restaurant in the kitchen. The wife did not even pay attention and did not rush to meet her husband. On the contrary, she was in parade, in a provocative dress with a huge slit and stiletto shoes. William asked tiredly, "Where are you going at night?" Olivia wrinkled her nose and answered reluctantly, "We thought we'd go to a hen party with some friends. Why can't I go?" The man shook his head disapprovingly. "Aren't you often going out at night? And the outfit is clearly not for a hen party. Don't you think you're overstepping your bounds?" Olivia suddenly grinned with a brightly painted mouth and replied caustically, "As I recall, you got the banker's job with my father's help. You should be happy about that. The rest is none of your business. I'll see you later. I'll be late." And she walked away, heels clacking loudly, not even looking back. Sam sank tiredly into the chair. He felt sick to his stomach. How sick and tired of everything. This marriage of convenience, this insufferable silicone doll Olivia, and this mansion where everything was foreign. It's like I'm living a life that doesn't belong to me. Honestly. And then he remembered the old woman's papers. They were still in her briefcase. Well, the evening's gone anyway. At least I'll leaf through them. And he went deep into reading, but when he saw the name of the sick woman, he almost collapsed. He shook with shock. Swan, Mary Swan, that can't be right. Oh my God. Is that what Anne looked like? That's it. The man jumped to the bar, took out a brandy, poured it into a glass, sipped a good portion, then leaned back in his chair and plunged into deep memories of the past. Mary grew up in the village. Her childhood was hardly a happy one. Her parents died too soon. Her mom was still in labor. Father 3 years later fell under a combine harvester due to negligence. So her granddaughter was raised by her grandfather Tom and grandmother Cynthia. They lived poor lives. We fed from the vegetable garden and the goat Zorka helped. Grandma made delicious cheese and milk porridge. As a child, Mary could be called more of an ugly duckling than a beauty. She was thin and unformed and a little wild. But when she finished school, everything changed. She simply turned into a beautiful swan. Slender, shapely beauty with prominent breasts of the third size and plump, naturally sensual lips. All the local men were openly staring at her with their tongues lolling. Grandmother Cynthia began to worry and kept teaching her granddaughter, "Don't spoil me, Mary, don't spoil me. Men have only one thing on their minds. They all promise beautifully. And as soon as what, immediately into the bushes." The girl remembered her grandmother's words and kept her defense firmly in place. She wouldn't let anyone get close to her. Work in the village was very sad, and Mary went to see Brown's farm out of despair. She got a job with a local rich man and tried to get used to the hard work, but it wasn't to be. The rich man was a notorious lover of women and booze. Everyone in the village knew it. So he began to court Mary. He pinched her back. He looked at her breasts point blank. He tried to press the frightened girl in a dark corner, and all whispering to her, "Mary, girl, you're so sweet, you're drooling. Be mine, I'll pay you. You'll walk in silk and bathe in gold." This fat, disgusting and nasty womanizer was so disgusting to Mary that she pushed him away with her eyes closed so as not to see his sweaty, nasty face. Then one day the girl couldn't stand it any longer, ran home, cried, and told Grandma Cynthia everything. "I'm not going back to the farm, Grandma. You can do anything you want. That nasty Brown's groping me, promising me gold, just to get me in bed with him. I'm so disgusted. What do I do? I don't know." Granny was outraged. She raised her hands to the sky. "Look at him. What a bastard." "It's not for nothing," the women whispered. "He won't miss a single skirt. And he's got a wife and 3 kids. And still he's a bloody bastard. Tom, come here. We're going to have a council meeting. Did you hear what my granddaughter's grieving about? What can we do? There's no other work in the village. Maybe we should go to the chairman and complain. Let him put a stop to this ghoul." Grandpa spat and waved his hand. "What's the use? They're all in on it. A hand washes hand. Mary's a good-looking girl. She'll never live here. She'll never live here. Let her go to town. There's a lot of people there. Nobody cares about anybody. Maybe she'll find a job. Maybe she'll get a good marriage. All the young people are going there. "And no one's lost yet," he added. Mary was both pleased and frightened at the prospect. Grandma Cynthia, agreeing with her husband, ran to the neighbors to ask for money for her granddaughter's church journey, and for the first time, for they had not a penny to spare. Thanks to kind people, they collected a decent amount. Grandmother divided everything in parts, wrapped it in a handkerchief, and began to give her granddaughter instructions. So, in one place do not keep everything, or at any time they will steal. Put a little in different pockets, and keep an eye on your purse and bag. I know you've got a mouth like a crow when they're gone. Keep looking. I've done the math, you'll have enough for a room and a month or two, and then you'll be on your own, and don't be lazy. Yeah, remember what I said about dogs. Come on, let's sit down for a while. It's time. Let me give you a hug, granddaughter. Don't forget your grandparents, don't forget to visit, said Grandma Cynthia. Grandma Cynthia cried and waved at her for a long time. Grandpa Tom only grumbled, "Why? By God, you're so damp. Think of good things, or they'll steal or something else. Everything will work out for Mary. She's a pretty girl, not lazy with a head." Mary was uneasy on the train. All sorts of bad thoughts were going into her head. But at the railway station, a very nice, intelligent man sat down in her compartment. They chatted merrily about all sorts of things. He was a joker and told interesting stories. The girl laughed without a word and completely relaxed. After a couple of hours, the man said goodbye and left. Mary looked in her bag for money, decided to order tea, and suddenly did not find her purse. She felt a chill inside. There was also most of the money there. The dazed girl rushed to the conductor. "My God, my traveling companion took out my wallet with money. I don't know how he did it. He was talking nonstop, and I had my ears hanging open. What should I do?" She just shrugged her shoulders. "Well, you young lady, you're crazy. Have you never traveled on a train? They steal more here than at railway stations. You should have been more careful with your possessions. You must have got off the train. Not a beneficiary. Now it's all gone." For the rest of the journey, Mary just roared like a beluga whale. She had no idea what to do or where to go. She scraped together some of her grandmother's sacks. But it was a drop in the ocean, not even enough for a room. She imagined horrible pictures of herself begging for alms or worse. She cursed herself with the last words. "God, what a fool I am." Her grandmother had said, "Keep your eyes open," but no. What a nice man. What will happen to me next if I have not yet arrived and already got into the story? Mary looked round fearfully as she stepped out of the station, clutching her traveling bag and her lady's bag. She looked lost and cornered. Her mind was a mess. Suddenly, an elderly, stylish, and expensively dressed lady approached her. She immediately recognized the young, frightened provincial girl, who was obviously in trouble. The stranger introduced herself. "Hello, darling. My name is Mrs. Zoe. I work as a recruiter, recruiting staff for clinics and companies. Did something happen to you?" The girl was even more frightened. She'd never even heard those words before. She answered quietly, sobbing. "My name is Mary, the first come from the village to look for work. All the neighbors collected money for me, so that I had enough for a room and food for the first time. But a man sat down with me on the train, and somehow he got into my confidence and stole my wallet. I don't know what to do, but keep in mind I won't do anything naughty. My grandmother warned me that in the big city, that kind of thing might be offered." Mrs. Zoe laughed heartily. "You don't get it, silly. I'm hiring maids, cleaners, not what you think. If you need a job like that, I can help you. You'll find a place to live, too. Housekeepers tend to live in rich people's houses. But I tell you right away, you need to work hard, unconditionally fulfill all the tasks. The owners do not bore and do not impertinent, but also do not do, you know what, as you put it, inappropriate things. And then there are those kind of people, just trying to sneak into bed with rich husbands." Mary calmed down, smiled, and nodded. "Then I agree. Don't worry, I'm not like that. I've never even had a boyfriend before. I'll try my best. You won't regret hiring me." That same day, Mrs. Zoe gave Mary a full briefing. It took another couple of days to teach her the ins and outs of being a maid, how to use modern appliances, and the girl was safely ensconced at the Pattersons' country mansion. They were bankers and very famous businessmen. Besides her, there was another maid, Amber, and a cook, Emma, living in the house. The head of the household, Mr. Ryan, was a stern, short man with glasses. He said a cursory hello to Mary without even looking at her. Mary didn't like his wife, Mrs. Amanda, at first. She was full-figured, dressed to the nines. She had a grimace of displeasure on her face, her lips were tight, and her gaze seemed to bore through her. She asked Mary who she was, where she was from, told her the rules of their family, the daily routine and her duties. At last the woman dropped out. My son Sam still lives with us. He's a student, finishing his degree in economics. He's in class right now. I warn you not to look in his direction. I know you hicks. Mary barely made it through the exam. Finally, she was released to the servants' quarters. There she met Amber. The woman asked quietly, in a businesslike manner, "What, has our heroine intimidated yet? She can do that. But don't worry, I'll teach you everything. They pay well and stable. You won't make that kind of money anywhere else. So just go along with it and do your job properly." "And Mrs. Amanda?" Mary asked. "Don't mind her. Try not to make her angry. I don't let her see you so much. She's always so disgruntled." And so began Mary's working life. At first, she wasn't very good at everything. After all, in the village, the girl, except for a broom and a rag, did not know any gadgets. But Amber, as promised, quickly taught her what to do, and in a month Mary could easily cope with any tasks. The pay was really good. Mary had never held such money in her hands before. It would have been all right if it hadn't been for Sam. When she first saw him, she was cleaning the windows in the hallway. The girl was stretching as hard as she could and trying to wipe as well as she could. The guy quietly came up behind her and admired. A tall, slender beauty. Her blonde curls fell out from under her bonnet. Droplets of sweat appeared on her temples. He couldn't take his eyes off the new maid and gazed at her shamelessly. Mary felt someone's gaze on her back and looked away. The fact that she was being stared at so intently by the owner's son, a tall, athletic, good-looking boy, made her uncomfortable. She yelped and almost fell to the floor from the stepladder, but Sam deftly picked her up and kept her from falling. When she found herself in the guy's arms, Mary was instantly dizzy. He smelled of expensive, brightly colored male perfume. The touch of his strong hands on her waist gave her goosebumps. The girl immediately jumped up and mumbled, "I'm sorry, Mr. Sam. You scared me. I didn't expect to see anyone at this hour. It's morning. Everyone's off to work." The young man winked at her. "Why so formal, Mr. Sam? Just call me Sam. I mean, we're the same age as you. And I take it you're Mary. Where did they make such a pretty girl? You shouldn't be a maid. You should be in a modeling agency. I'm delighted." "I'm delighted." The girl blushed, embarrassed by the compliment. She apologized again and grabbed a bucket and a rag and ran off. Next, she and Amber went to beat out the cushions, and her partner whispered to her, "I saw the master's boy near you. Don't even think about it, or they'll kill you." She'd take 3 hides for her favorite son. Though he's a good-looking boy, I don't doubt it. But you realize there's nothing but a bed for guys like us. So why spoil your career? You'll be disgraced, and then no decent house will hire you. Mary nodded her head. "Yes, I'll try to keep out of his sight. I don't want any trouble." From that day on, Mary's job became a game of hide and seek. Especially when the boy came home after class. The more she tried to stay out of his sight, he would appear out of nowhere and try to talk to her. It seemed like a harmless conversation, nothing like that, but the way he looked at her, it was more expressive than any fervent confession. It was a look that made Mary's insides tear up and turn upside down. A million butterflies fluttered in her stomach. She'd go into a stupor, blush, and like a little girl, just run away. Another weekend came. Amber was released home, and she went into town. Her hosts, too, had gone to an important acquaintance for an appointment and said they would definitely be gone until evening. Mary had faithfully completed all her errands and was quite free. Only she had nowhere to go. No one and nowhere was waiting for her in the capital, and to go home to the village and back, far away. So the girl decided to walk along the forest paths, to breathe fresh air. She was enjoying nature, breathing in the fresh aroma of pine needles and herbs and thinking about her own thoughts. Suddenly, as if out of thin air, Sam appeared right in front of her. She even jerked from surprise. The boy laughed. "Hello, Mary, I scared you again, but I'm sorry I came home early. I thought I'd go for a run. I work out a lot around here. I see my beautiful girl coming, but how could I run past her?" Mary blushed again, and Sam suddenly pressed her against a mighty pine tree and passionately kissed her plump, sensual lips. The girl tried to moo and fight back at first, but after a second she just got dizzy and her legs gave out from the pleasure, and she stopped resisting. How sweet those kisses and hugs of his were. The strong, trained body, the scent of a man, and that look that paralyzed her. Breaking out of the embrace at last and breathing heavily, Mary stammered, "Sam, don't. What are you doing? What do you want me for? I'm just a country maid. I'm no match for you. We can't be together. Your mother warned me on the first day to stay away from you." The boy answered her eagerly. "My silly girl, you don't know your own worth. You're a beauty, a goddess. You're a naive girl, a girl who would be envied by her peers. Ever since I saw you, I've lost sleep and peace. Honestly, you're all I can think about. But for some reason you repel me. I can feel that you like me too." But Mary suddenly cried and ran to her room. She locked herself inside, fell on the bed, and sobbed even harder. Sam was right. They were drawn to each other like a magnet. There was nothing they could both do about it. And now, after such a passionate kiss, she was literally shaking. Her whole being, which had never known male love and affection before, literally demanded continuation. She scolded herself. What kind of a fool am I? Again, I'm looking for problems on my head. But why did I fall in love with him? What kind of punishment is this? There was a soft knock at the door. Sam whispered, "Mary, open up, please. We need to talk." The girl exhaled, wiped her tears, and went to open the door. On the doorstep stood a guy, smiling guiltily and holding a charming bouquet of daisies in his hand. "I'm sorry if I scared you or offended you. I didn't mean to. Honestly, know this, you're the most beautiful girl I've ever met, the most pure and open. And I'm totally in love with you. I called my parents. They're going to be gone for a while. We're all alone in the house, except for the gardener. Let's go to my room. It's a bit awkward to talk in here." And Mary went, of course. They talked long and warmly. Sam confessed his love, and then he began to cover her neck and body with tender kisses and whispered some words to her. Anyway, that was the day of their first intimacy. The guy was amazed that Mary was a virgin. I mean, she's 19 years old. That's unthinkable by city standards. He began to treat her even more tenderly and reverently, realizing that she had given him the most precious thing. From that day, they began to meet, first secretly, furtively kissing in secluded corners, and then officially. After all, the secret always comes out. Sam really did love Mary very much. He wasn't playing around, and he intended to marry her. The guy sincerely believed that his parents would understand him. After all, true love is more important than ranks and regalia. But when he announced this officially at dinner and introduced Mary as his bride, in the family, Pattison broke into a deafening scandal. Mrs. Amanda screamed like a madwoman. "It'll never happen. Sam, are you out of your mind? What surprised you so much in bed with that hillbilly that you'd marry a maid? Do you want our family name all over the press and high society? It's an unheard of disgrace." Then she turned her furious face towards Mary and shouted, "Get out of here. I knew I shouldn't have hired a hillbilly as a maid, and you're a good girl. You're not losing your way. You're like a leech to my son. You want a residence permit in the capital and to live in chocolate. You'll get by. You'll have to earn money first. You're used to spreading your legs." Mary sobbed and tried to justify herself. "Why are you doing this? Sam and I really love each other. We don't need anything. Money isn't the most important thing in life." Mrs. Amanda pointed at the door. "Out, you're fired. I'll complain to the agency and they won't hire you in any decent home again." Mary ran off in tears to pack her things. Amber whispered to her, "I told you to fool around with Sam and that's it. Mom won't let you two go out, let alone get married." The girl sobbed. "I don't believe it. He said he loved me and couldn't live without me. He's coming for me now and we'll leave this house together." Amber only twisted her head and went away from the sin, or else she would get under the hot hand. Meanwhile, the battles continued. Sam was screaming with emotion. "Oh, that's it. Then I'll leave. We'll live on our own. If $1 million is more important to you than the happiness of your beloved son. I love her, don't you understand? I really love her." Then my father intervened. He had been watching silently until then. "Well, son, here's a scale. On one half put your career, your wealth, your rich and happy life and our help. And on the other half put your Mary and that's it. How long can you last with her in some cockroach-infested dorm with no decent facilities? How long can you stand working 12 hours a day? You'll run away from that life in a month. But I won't take you back. That's my condition. It's your choice. If you leave with her now, I'll block all your cards and you'll never come back here. Oh, by the way, your sweetheart's leaving with a suitcase. Well, you better run after her." Mary turned round for a second and tried to catch Sam's eye, but he lowered his eyes and didn't move. The girl shouted after him, "Coward, bastard, I hate you." And she ran away crying. Everything was boiling inside her, and there was more bitterness than anger. Amber was right, too. They all want the same thing. How could he, Mary thought. He promised he wouldn't betray her, and we'd be together till the end. He said all those words, swore he loved me. But he's a mama's boy. I despise him. And I fell in love, stupid me. I'd rather go out and have fun. It was a good thing she hadn't spent much of the money she'd earned over the months. She managed to rent a corner with a lovely woman, Mrs. Caroline, on the outskirts of town. But when Mary realized a month later that she was pregnant, she was horrified and burst into tears again. After telling her landlady everything honestly, Mary heard, "Why don't you tell your fiancé you're pregnant? Maybe he will come to his senses and marry. Or help. Anything can happen." But Mary just waved her hand. "No, Caroline, he won't marry. He can't get away from his mom. If this hero finds out I'm pregnant, he'll kill me. I'd rather have an abortion." Mrs. Caroline shook her head and looked at the girl disapprovingly. "Don't you dare. Don't take such a sin on your soul. You'll get her back on her feet, won't you? You're not the first. You're not the last. I'll help as much as I can. I'll keep an eye on her. And killing a living soul is the last thing you want to do. A child is God's plan. It's not given to everyone. I would have given anything to have children, but God didn't give it to me. That's all." That's how they got on. Mary got a job at a kiosk nearby selling baked goods. The owner was an Armenian. Ashot he saw, of course, that the woman already had a small belly. He understood everything. But still he hired her. He felt sorry for her. He knew that this place is not much sought after, and this one will hold on to the job with her teeth. And so it was. Mary was a saleswoman right up until she went into labor. When she went into labor, she rang Ashot and said in a panic, "I've closed the kiosk. I'm going to the hospital. The keys are where they usually are. Don't hire anyone to take my place, I beg you. Better put me on the night shift or 24/7. When the hospital brought her a large, cheeky Anne, she kissed her and cried, so much the baby looked like Sam. The woman whispered, "Your daddy doesn't want us." "Well, to hell with him. We'll live on our own. We're good, we can handle it." The first year of the child's life was especially hard for Mary. The woman was literally torn between work and the baby. She was sleeping 4 hours at a time, and that was on and off. Thanks to Caroline, she helped out, and Anne was quiet too. Didn't give the old nanny much trouble, but then it got easier. And went to nursery. If she was sick, she stayed with Caroline or sat in Mary's kiosk on the sacks in the corner, drawing. Not once during this time did Sam make any sign of himself. He had simply cut that fleeting romance with the maid out of his life. That was all. And Mary, angry as she was, couldn't get Sam out of her heart. He sat there firmly. Though she had mixed feelings for him now, hatred, anger, contempt, love, tenderness, awe, she realized that they would never even meet again. He was too high-flying, and she should forget him and move on. But she could not. That fateful night, Mary was hurrying home to her daughter. She was just crossing the road at the crossroads when the pedestrian light turned green, and Mary went. And then a bright red sports car flew straight at her at breakneck speed. The woman only had time to notice that behind the wheel was a blonde, and that was it. Then there was a screech of brakes and darkness. Sam, of course, didn't know any of this. Ever since he'd shown cowardice and betrayed Mary, they hadn't spoken to each other. His parents had talked him into marrying Olivia, daughter of a millionaire banker and owner of the coolest and most expensive petrol stations in town. The wedding was lavish and pompous. The chosen one was a platinum blonde doll, skillfully molded by the best specialists. The figure was also without flaws, and all would be fine if it weren't for one but. Sam didn't like her one bit. Not only that, but the arrogant, insolent girl was frankly unpleasant to him. Olivia, on the other hand, really liked Sam, athletic, tall, pumped up, and handsome. That's why the wedding took place. But having quickly satisfied all her sexual desires in bed, the glamorous woman was frankly bored. She wanted to drive, to fly to Paris or holiday in Bali, that she was carried in her arms and worshipped, and earlier fans did so. The spouse was different. He burned day and night at work. His daddy gave him the position of manager of a large bank. When she looked into his eyes, she wanted to see admiration, but there was a look of contempt in his eyes. It so pissed off the woman that she, not thinking long, made a lover out of boredom, then another one, and then another. Sam sensed something wrong and began to voice his resentment. They began to fight a lot. He couldn't understand how a married lady could go out all night and come home in the morning drunk. It was unheard of. But Olivia put him off every time. "You live in my mansion and work in my father's bank, So sit tight and keep your mouth shut, or I'll report you to Daddy, and they'll throw you out like a dog. What am I supposed to do with you at home? Stand at the cooker and have screaming babies? Oh no. That's not what I was born to do, Olivia replied. Sam was outraged. Why did you get married in the first place? I don't get it. If you don't want a family and children. The woman laughed. The same thing you did. Who asked us? It was profitable for the parents. That's all. Now they have a powerful corporation. Everybody's happy. Me too, by the way. In high society, I have a decent husband. And I'm a lady of status. Where do I spend my nights? That's none of your business. I'm bored in bed with you. I'm bored with everything. So they lived like cat and dog. Two complete strangers under the same roof slept in separate rooms long ago. The intimacy faded. Sam regretted 1,000 times that he'd chickened out and betrayed his beloved. He had never forgotten Mary and knew he would never love anyone so much again. Sam reread the diagnosis over and over again, whispering to himself, Mary Swan, God. It turns out Anne is my daughter. My favorite woman is living in poverty and dying, and I'm sitting here. He searched for Brandy with shaking hands, dialed the number of the hospital, and found out where Mary was lying. Without putting it off, the man went there and decided to talk to the attending doctor. The time was late, but money decides everything, so the doctor agreed to meet. He sighed and answered, I'll be honest, Mrs. Swan's situation couldn't be worse. She suffered a severe head injury in the collision. She's been in a coma for a month with no progress. There is only one chance to change something. It is to carry out urgent brain surgery and remove the damaged areas. But here too, no one guarantees that the woman will tolerate it and survive it all. Personally, I will not take such responsibility. There is only one specialist in the capital, a virtuoso of his craft and a lover of experiments. That's Mr. Andrew Willis. You should contact him. He might be willing to operate. But then again, it's a very expensive operation, and as I understand it, the family doesn't have the money. Sam was shaking. He was almost screaming. Give me the coordinates on this guy Willis. I'll meet him tomorrow. Can I see her for a few minutes, please? The doctor just waved his hand, saying no problem. The patient was no good anyway. The man quietly entered the ICU room. What he saw shocked him. Instead of a fresh, glowing Mary, there was a haggard woman lying on the bed, her eyes sunken, her cheeks gone. The color of her face blended in with the sheets, not a speck of blood, and her skinny body was wrapped in dozens of sensors and wires. Sam instinctively took her hand. It was icy and dry, and began to whisper to her, Mary, my girl, forgive me, you bastard. You will not die. Do you hear me? I'll die for you, but I'll get you out of death's clutches, for your daughter, for us. I still love you. Do you hear me? Believe me. He even thought her eyelids fluttered, and he begged her forgiveness again and again. The very next day, Sam put all his business aside and went to see a famous medical luminary. Mr. Andrew Willis carefully studied all of Mary's medical records and thought for a moment, then said, The operation could certainly be done, but it would only be at my own risk. There is no 50% certainty that the patient will survive. There's no time to lose. Do you understand? Most likely irreversible processes have already started, and the woman can either die immediately without regaining consciousness or remain, how can I put it mildly, incapacitated. I'll write down the amount. It's very large, I warn you. And I emphasize again that the risk of death is enormous, and I'm only agreeing to this because it's the first time I've ever done it, purely out of experimental interest. Sam started to calm him down. But you said yourself that if nothing is done, Mary will die anyway, and there's no chance of her coming out of the coma and recovering. Isn't she an incapacitated person now? So why not try to save her life, if there was even a 1% chance of a miracle happening? The sum was really huge. Even for a wealthy man like Sam, he'd emptied all his cards and accounts and quickly sold the expensive Porsche he'd recently bought. And that was barely enough to cover all the expenses. Immediately, he made a transfer to the clinic and phoned Mrs. Caroline. Good afternoon, Mrs. Caroline. It's Mr. Sam for you. Remember we talked about the loan for your friend Mary Swan? I have some news for you. Give me your address. I'll be right over. On the way, the businessman stopped at the Children's World shop and bought Anne a new jacket, boots and more clothes, toys and 2 bags of groceries. He had trouble finding the house number in the yards. The dwelling was old, but quite well maintained and cozy. They were already waiting for him there. The kettle was boiling in the kitchen. The old woman was fussing and setting the table. Anne hovered round and helped her grandmother. An excited Mrs. Caroline said hello, invited her guest to the table and asked, "Thank you, Mr. Sam, for not forgetting about us. Will you give us a loan? Will they approve it?" That's what the hospital says, that it's too late. They're saying Mary's not likely to make it. I don't want to believe that. And the old woman began to wipe away the tears from her eyes with the corner of her handkerchief. The man hastened to reassure her. "Don't worry, you won't need a loan. No one would give you such a huge sum with your income. I've already paid for everything. The operation is the day after tomorrow at the Institute of Neurosurgery. It'll be performed by the best luminary in the capital, Mr. Andrew Willis. I've arranged. Let's pray and hope for the best." The old woman even splashed her hands and could not believe what she heard. "Lord, Savior, you're our benefactor. What a lot of money this is. God willing, Mary will be all right. We'll make it work. As long as she lives." And came over quietly and put her warm little arms around Sam's neck. She looked straight into his eyes and said, "Thank you, Uncle. I will pray for you now and for Mummy to survive. She won't die, will she? She's all I've got besides her and Grandma Caroline." Sam instinctively hugged the little girl and felt such warmth and tenderness inside. He gently flicked her nose and held out 2 huge bags. "These are all for you, and clothes and toys. If you're not the right size, I'll change them in a jiffy." The woman and the girl gasped, and the little girl ran happily trying on clothes and looking at toys, and the businessman began to put on the table products from the other bags. "This is also for you for the first time. Sort it out. I think I got the essentials." Mrs. Caroline even cried. "Thank you so much, dear man, for caring so much for strangers. It's a time when you forget your own family, and even strangers." Sam suddenly said in a hoarse, broken voice, "Mary is not a stranger to me, you know. She's my first love, my strongest love. And I betrayed her once. I was a coward. I'm a bastard and a bad man. I've ruined my fate and hers. Maybe Anne is my daughter too, I don't know. So I really want her to live, and I'll be on my knees begging her forgiveness." He waved his hand and walked away, trying to suppress the sobs that burst from his chest. On the day of the operation, Sam didn't go to the bank at all, shifting all the duties to the deputy. He walked like a caged tiger through the hospital corridor and waited. Time seemed to stop and the hand of the clock stood still. He asked God sincerely, as best he could, in his own words, "God help. I wish Mary had lived. I know I'm a scoundrel and I'm very guilty before her, but you can see that I still love her. I don't want anyone else but her. Make her well, please." Mrs. Caroline and Anne sat quietly on the couch. The girl did not cry, only stared silently at one point, apparently also praying and waiting. 4 hours passed. At last Mr. Andrew Willis came out of the operating theater. He took off his cap and approached Mr. Pattison. "Well, gentlemen, you may rejoice. I don't want to boast, but I'm very pleased with the result. Now let's look at the dynamics. But the odds are good that the woman will come round. Let's hope for the best. You two split up. You can't see her yet. She's in intensive care. Come back tomorrow." Sam shook the professor's hand and thanked him, and also ran to the doctor and said tearfully, "Thank you for saving Mummy. She's going to be all right, isn't she?" The doctor averted his eyes and quietly replied, "I really want to believe that your Mummy will get well, but it's not all up to me. I did everything I could. The operation was a success." Mary finally regained consciousness. Out of a thick, heavy fog, she heard her daughter's voice. "Hello, Mummy, how are you? Are you feeling better? When will you open your eyes? I miss you so much and I pray every day. Me and Caroline and I are going to go and get you some medicine, and there's someone who wants to talk to you." And then Mary heard the same husky voice she'd never forgotten. "Mary, my darling, it's me. Sam, I'm sorry, darling. I'm a bastard. I betrayed you so badly. I can't believe it's been so long since I've forgotten you. I remember all our kisses, your iridescent laughter, your big, beautiful eyes. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I really want you to get better." Everything inside the woman suddenly turned upside down and warm. She gathered herself with all her strength and wanted to shout to the whole world, "I haven't forgotten you either. I love you too," but she only managed to open her eyes slightly and whisper, "I too." All the sensors on the life support system suddenly turned red and beeped, and a terrified Sam ran out after the nurse. "Get over here. Come on, Mary's awake." Just then, a bunch of staff rushed into the room. There was a commotion, looking at the woman's pupils and checking for reactions. The man was escorted out the door. Anne and the grandmother came up and were very frightened when they saw the panic in the room. The baby immediately cried. Is Mommy ill? Why are there so many doctors in there? Is she getting worse? The man pressed the little girl to himself and calmed her down. On the contrary, Bunny, don't worry. Mummy woke up. She heard your voice and mine and came to her senses. I can't even believe it. They were finally allowed to see Mary. The woman saw all the family and friends and cried. Anne threw herself on her mother's neck and began to hug and kiss her. Mary whispered, "Daughter, darling, how worried I was about you. How glad I am that all is well. Baba Caroline, thank you for looking after my little girl. Not abandoned, not sent to the orphanage. Sam, how are you doing? I thought I'd never see you again." The old lady said, "So that's him, the bank director where Anne and I went to get a loan. Mr. Pattison paid for your operation. If it wasn't for him, I don't know. You never stood a chance. Only the famous Professor Willis took it on his own risk, and that was because Sam miraculously persuaded him to do it. So there you go." Mary looked at Sam with gratitude and tenderness and softly, "Thank you for life. You're my guardian angel now. Sam, we probably need to talk." Anne and her grandmother nodded understandingly and left the room. The man came closer. He looked at this short-haired woman with huge, attractive eyes and admired her. He compared her to Olivia's doll-like artificial face and realized that he would never be able to be under the same roof with her for a second. The man took Mary's hand and said, looking directly into her eyes, "Sweetheart, forgive me if you can. I'm so sorry to you. I chickened out. I went along with my parents. Who knows how much I regretted it later. They talked me into marrying Olivia, the daughter of a millionaire. But she and I are total strangers. We live like cat and dog. You're still in my heart, and I don't want anyone else." Mary's eyes immediately filled with tears. "So you're married. So we're not going to work out again. But I want you to know that Anne is your daughter. I found out about the pregnancy after we broke up and decided to keep the baby." Sam waved his hands. "I've already guessed that Anne is mine. I'm not leaving you now, you know that. I'm going to talk to Olivia tonight, and we're going to split up. I want to live with you and my daughter. Do you understand? I'm begging you to believe me this time, please." Mary grinned bitterly. "Do you think she'll give you a divorce that easily? And if she doesn't? I'm scared. I remember how your mother humiliated and embarrassed me back then. I don't want to go through that again." The man replied quietly, "Don't worry and don't think bad thoughts. Get well. I've bought all the medicines. I'll come every day. Why don't you tell me how it happened? Why haven't they found the person who hit you?" The woman sighed and shrugged. "I don't remember much." The light turned green. I walked across the crosswalk. Suddenly, this red car came out of the darkness. I only caught a glimpse of the blonde behind the wheel, and that was it. Sam bent down and kissed Mary gently. "I'll take care of it. The perpetrator must be punished, but I've got to run. Know this, I'm happy I found you and I won't let myself lose you again, and I won't let anyone else hurt you." Mary brushed away a tear. "Be that as it may, I love you, Sam, and all these years I've never been able to tear you from my heart." Sam arrived home late that night. To his surprise, Olivia was home waiting for him. She looked worried. "Oh, where have you been for so long? What's going on? You've never been late before. Dad said you sold your car and withdrew all the funds from your accounts. What was that for?" The man sighed and replied, "Olivia, we need to have a serious talk. I needed the money to help someone who was in trouble. I want to divorce you. We've been strangers for a long time, and we don't like each other, and you know it. So why torture each other? Besides, you have someone else, I know. I, too, met a woman I'd foolishly lost years ago, and I still loved her dearly." Olivia's face twisted with anger. "Is this the maid your mother kicked out in a huff? And you spent all your money on her? Or are you out of your mind? I won't give you a divorce, you know that. I don't want to be the talk of the high society. I'll call my dad right now, and you'll be left with nothing." Surprisingly, Sam wasn't frightened or upset. On the contrary, he was somewhat relieved. "I don't care. Do what you want. I'm packing my bags, I'm leaving, and we're getting a divorce. It should have been done a long time ago." Olivia was taken aback by her husband's determination. After all, he had never crossed her before. She screamed hysterically and started calling her favorite daddy. Sam silently packed his things into his suitcase. He wanted to be free from the shackles he had fallen into so many years ago with the help of his parents. Now he had someone to take risks for, and he wanted to change his life dramatically for Mary and his daughter. The scandal was devastating. The millionaire was furious. He immediately fired Sam from his position as a banker, blocked all his accounts, and even came to the hospital. He tried to intimidate Mary, but it didn't work. This time, the woman stood her ground. "You can even kill me if you want to, but I won't give up Sam. We love each other. Do you understand or not?" Just to be on the safe side, Mrs. Caroline went away with Anne to a friend's house in the country, out of harm's way. I don't know what those crazy millionaires might think. Sam wasted no time. He moved into a rented flat for the time being and decided to watch the SecTV cameras at the very junction where Mary had been hit. What he saw shocked him. The red foreign car belonged to his father-in-law, and his wife Olivia was behind the wheel, not alone, but with a young lover. The footage clearly shows her hitting Mary and then driving off, without even looking back. That's a twist. The man was pissed. What a bastard. How can you hit someone and not even get out of the car to check on them? No help. How can you live your life in peace after that, going to expensive salons, tanning salons, and fitness centers, knowing that you may have killed a man? Such cynicism simply didn't sit right with him. He made an appointment with the city's video camera company and picked up the footage. Without thinking, he dialed Olivia's number. She answered right away. "What is it, darling? You scared? Did your chicken come to its senses? That's right. Come back immediately and apologies while I'm being kind." The man interrupted her menacingly. "Listen to me. I've got the kecked footage of you hitting Mary and fleeing the scene, and I'm going to the police with it tomorrow. How much time do you think you're going to get and what they'll say about you in high society? You're a piece of shit, aren't you? You almost killed a man yourself. You have a young lover, and you dare to accuse me of something. Or should I show this tape to your father? I think I'll do that. I'll send him a copy so he can admire his precious daughter." Olivia's voice trembled, and she changed her tone. "Sam, listen, don't get too excited. I don't go to the police. I don't want to go to jail. I wouldn't survive there. And don't tell my dad. He'll kill me. You know how he is. What do you want? Let's make a deal." Sam said, "You'll transfer the money that went to Mary's operation into my account, and you'll convince your daddy to leave Mary and me alone, and you're going to disappear from my life forever. Otherwise, I will carry out my threat. Is that clear?" Olivia spoke quickly. "Yes, of course I'll do it. We'll part quietly and peacefully. Thank you. You're right. I never loved you either. And the other night, I had a few too many drinks, and when I realized I'd hit a man, I just drove off. That's all. What was I supposed to do? Go to jail voluntarily?" The man sighed. "God is your judge. I've said my piece. Bye." Olivia kept her word. She wired Sam the money he'd spent on the surgeries, and the millionaire dad stopped harassing Sam and Mary. The woman recovered quickly. Sam visited her in the hospital every day. They talked at length, holding hands and feeling their hearts beating in unison. Soon Mary was discharged home. Mrs. Caroline returned from the village with Anne, and at a family meeting it was decided that they should live together in the old woman's house. She'd asked for it. "My dears, all of you, come and live with me. I'm all alone. I've grown so fond of Anne and Mary, they're like family to me now, even closer. It's a nice house. It could do with a bit of work. It hasn't seen a man's hand in years, and when I die, I'll leave it to you. I have no relatives anyway, but I have my own yard, vegetable garden. My child has a place to run around, and I'm not bored in my old age." Everyone agreed happily. In just a couple of months, Sam made a major renovation, expanded the kitchen, equipped the nursery, and added another room, a living room. Everything turned out modern and cozy. The man did not regret at all that he was now not a rich man at all. He got a job in a small firm as an economist and worked hard. He forbade Mary from selling at the kiosk. To keep her at home, he bought her a sewing machine. After all, the woman had dreamed of it since she was a child, and finally she enrolled in a sewing course. She began to do very well. And soon the first orders came in. Mary couldn't help but rejoice. She didn't have to work 12 hours a day carrying crates. She enjoyed her home, her family, and her favorite hobby. Sam had changed a lot over the years. He went from a fun-loving well-to-do major to a serious and responsible family man. 3 months passed. Anne called the man Uncle Sam, and it bothered him a lot, and he decided that it was time to tell the girl the whole truth and put her on his surname, as it should be. In the evening, the man sat down beside the child in a chair and began an important conversation. "Anne, I need to have a serious talk with you. You see, I'm not just another man's uncle. I'm your real daddy, and I'd like to call you my daughter and give you my last name. What do you think about that?" The girl looked at him strangely and suddenly asked, "If you are my daddy, why didn't you live with us before? Where have you been all this time? So is it because of you that Mum cried a lot at night? Did you abandon us? You didn't love us? Why do you love us now? What if you leave again and Mummy cries? Because if you love, you don't leave." And threw the pencil on the floor and ran away crying. Sam was very upset, though he realized that his daughter was right about everything. If she loved him, she wouldn't leave him. But he did. Mary began to comfort him. "I told you, it's still early. She wouldn't understand. She's too young." Mrs. Caroline decided to intervene in the conversation, though she didn't usually do so, but this was too serious a matter. "Now, children, I'm going to talk to Anne. She's just very upset with her father. I mean, she's seen her mother in poverty for so many years. We've got to explain it to her properly. She's a smart girl, and she's old enough to understand. She'll understand." Mrs. Caroline went quietly into Anne's room. She was lying with her head on the pillow, sobbing. The pensioner began to speak as if not to her, but simply into space. "Once upon a time there was a prince and a princess. They loved each other very much. But a wicked witch came and broke them up, separated them." The girl suddenly said angrily, "Stop treating me like a little girl, Grandma. I'm an adult and I understand everything. My father left my mother and he didn't need us for so many years, and now he's fallen in love with us. And then suddenly he won't love us anymore. Is that it?" The old woman sighed. "Well, if you're an adult, then listen to another story. It's like that, and you're right. Your father was young and listened to his mother. She told him not to love your mum. Yes, he got cold feet. They broke up. Your mother realized she was pregnant with you, but she didn't say anything to the groom. So you can't blame him either. He just didn't know about you, you know. And when he read the papers and realized it was the woman he loved who was dying, what did he do? That's right, he saved her. Like a fairy tale. And why? Because, my dear, he loves her very much. Now don't you understand that? Your daddy was very happy when he found out he had a daughter. Now you're together, a family. So what's wrong with that, tell me? Don't you love him?" The little girl answered quietly, "I do, and I want it to be always so." Mrs. Caroline then added, Well, then why do you take offense? We are not angels and often do bad things as well as good. There's nothing you can do about it. That's how human beings are. The main thing is that my father realized his mistake, repented, and now you two are together. It's not our business to judge him. Parents should be accepted and loved, whatever they are, because they are the closest people to you, understand? The girl wiped her nose, smiled, and hugged her grandmother. "Grandma Caroline, how clever you are. You told me everything so well. Why did I, silly me, get angry with Daddy?" She ran happily into the living room, taking Sam's hand. "Come on, Daddy. Let's go and have tea. Only that big chocolate candy is mine." The man happily picked. "It can't be. I robbed her of her money." The ex-husband froze when he saw his rich wife on TV. In one of Jersey City's parks, children were frolicking, couples were strolling, and young mothers with strollers were relaxing after household chores. Christopher stood by a small fountain, holding a single rose. His hands were trembling with excitement. The young, handsome 20-year-old was waiting for his girlfriend Allison, who was already 20 minutes late. She can't not show up, the young man thought to himself. Christopher had been dating Allison for a couple months now, and he'd never had her late or ignore a meeting. Finally, he saw her thin silhouette in the distance. She wasn't walking, she was floating down the road. Her gait was so graceful and airy. Christopher was tired of waiting for the time to come. He walked towards her, and as soon as the girl approached, Christopher noticed that the expression on her face was sad. "What's wrong?" he asked. "I knew you had some kind of misfortune." Christopher was worried and hugged his favorite girl. Allison didn't hug him back and didn't take the flower. The girl, embarrassed, didn't want to tell the reason for her sadness. Christopher looked her straight in the eyes and asked her to keep quiet. "I'm beginning to worry," he said. "Is your grief so great that you can't even share it with me?" My grief is you," Allison said, and looked up at Christopher. He tensed. He hadn't done her any harm, hadn't hurt her in any way. He was generally trying to do his best to make Allison happy. He asked for clarification on exactly how he could have spoiled his beloved's mood. "You're very nice, but I'm tired of walking in parks and sitting on benches," Allison said. "You've never once invited me to a restaurant, never given me anything but these roses. You realize I need a man around me, not a boy. There's no hope for you. I can't see you as my rock." "You can just say you don't want to have a relationship with a poor man," Christopher said. The boy was insulted, humiliated, and angry. Because of this, he himself was well aware that he had no money. Christopher couldn't give Allison an expensive gift, invite her even to a movie. That would undoubtedly do a lot of damage to his wallet. "How can I have money if I'm only 20? Christopher didn't understand. "We still have a long way to go. You and I are going to grow and develop together." Allison waved her head. "I don't want to wait, I don't want to grow, and I don't want to drag anyone forward," she replied. "I want a grown-up, established man." Christopher didn't seem like the kind of man who could ever accomplish anything. Her words cut him to the core. 10 years had passed since then, and he still hadn't forgotten Allison's words. He never met that girl again. How she turned out, he didn't know. But Christopher had learned that all women were only after money, and no one was interested in sincere feelings. Allison gave him a prejudice against all girls at once. Christopher could not build a serious relationship and did not even try to get close to anyone for quite a long time. By the way, there was some truth in Allison's statement. Christopher really did not aspire to a lot of money. He had misunderstood the girl. She wasn't saying that the guy was indigent and couldn't do anything in this life. She just wanted a different standard of living. She wanted to live a rich life, and Christopher could only give her an average one. She tried to explain this to him, but it was all pointless. Christopher wasn't looking for a big paycheck. He was the kind of man who believed that big money could not be earned by honest labor. So he didn't even try. He always said that rich people were either lucky or crooks. But he never thought he would fall into one of those categories, or maybe both. Christopher was already 30 years old when he met Elizabeth. He was working at a car repair shop, and an expensive car had been brought to him. It was the kind of brand their auto repair shop had never seen before. When Christopher saw the owner of the car, his jaw nearly dropped to the floor. Elizabeth noticed the surprise. She was even pleased. The young businesswoman herself offered Christopher her phone number. She didn't look at the lack of men. She could take care of herself and fulfill her own desires. And Christopher thought for the first time that with a girl like Elizabeth he could try to build something serious. Elizabeth certainly didn't seem mercantile to him in this situation. Rather, he was becoming a keeper. Of course, the man did not assume that a rich girl could consider him as a potential fiancé. But already after the first date, it was clear that Elizabeth was not looking for a one-night stand. Although she was rich, she did not have the main treasure. She was lonely. But it couldn't be said that Christopher was her last option. No, she did take an interest in the simple car mechanic. And Christopher fell in love with Elizabeth. And not just for the money. 6 months into their relationship, he and Elizabeth were married. One day the man caught himself thinking that he was the lucky man he had thought of with contempt throughout his life. The man himself did not seem to have fully realized what he loved more than Elizabeth herself, or the life she had provided for him. And Elizabeth had spared nothing for the one she loved. Christopher no longer needed to work at the auto shop. He was learning the intricacies of running a business. Elizabeth thought about giving him his own car service for their anniversary. But for now, it was just a thought. In principle, she was happy with everything as it was. She was just worried that her spouse might consider himself uncomfortable with the fact that he lived at his wife's expense. But Christopher didn't feel any inferiority. He was more than happy with everything. Elizabeth and Christopher decided to celebrate the first anniversary of their marriage alone with each other without any lavish festivities. The couple booked a table at a restaurant. Before that, they took a boat ride. It was a day just for the two of them. But their plans were not destined to materialize. Throughout the day, Elizabeth received calls from her assistant, Ben. The young man couldn't get through. First, Elizabeth hung up, and then she turned off the phone so that nothing distracted her from communicating with her husband. Ben wrote messages that went unanswered. Eventually, he found out that his boss was celebrating her anniversary at a restaurant, so she was ignoring his calls. Ben had a lot of reasons to worry, and some pretty serious ones. There was no putting off the conversation. In the middle of the evening, when Elizabeth and Christopher were about to exchange gifts, her assistant burst into the restaurant. The girl still hadn't gotten the papers for the car service she was going to present to her spouse. "Elizabeth Igorevna, we agreed with you that if I call more than 3 times, it means that there is trouble," Ben said, panting. He was obviously running to the boss with all his legs. That was why his breathing was labored. Well, what could have been so serious on Saturday, Elizabeth didn't understand. If it was really urgent, you could have written a message and then called. The assistant replied that it wasn't just urgent, it was an emergency. He offered to step aside and talk, but Elizabeth told him she had no secrets from her husband. "You're due for an inspection on Monday," Ben told her. "And it will be the kind of inspection that will find exactly what it's looking for," he added. "We've been through so many of these inspections already that it's simply impossible to intimidate me with them," Elizabeth replied with a laugh. She always used this particular form of her employee's name when she wanted to show that she considered his words to be a mere trifle. "We've been set up this time," Ben said seriously. "Your partner, with whom, let's face it, we weren't exactly working a clean scheme, has been cooperating with the police and with the IRS. He himself was recently nailed, which is why he wants to pull you out after him." Elizabeth tensed. She was starting to worry now, too. She wanted to hug Ben, to thank him for being able to find her after all. But there was no time for tenderness. She needed to find out what Elizabeth was in danger of being tested, and what she could do to avoid the consequences. "Unfortunately, Elizabeth, it could get you jail time," Ben said without joy at all. "And there is only one way to avoid it." Elizabeth was literally numbed by the words of her assistant. She had never expected that one of her business partners could set her up so seriously. The girl conducted her business honestly, without gray schemes and fraud. And she always trusted her partners. It turns out that it was someone's planned scheme to get her out of the game. Ben said that the person who set it all up agreed to go along with it only if Elizabeth would hand over the business to him. But she'd still have to face an audit from the IRS. "How can I get out of this situation?" Elizabeth didn't understand. "You said there was an option, but I don't see any way out. I can't give my business to someone I don't know." "Unfortunately, if you don't sign over all your assets to someone else, you'll be ruined," Ben said. Christopher sat silent the whole time. He didn't understand anything about his wife's affairs. The only thing he could realize was that she was in deep trouble. Elizabeth was crying bitterly, completely confused. Christopher stood next to his beloved and hugged her. The girl clung to his arm. "But you can sign everything over to someone you trust," Ben suggested. "We'll declare you bankrupt. If you don't have anything, there's nothing to take away. It's better to hand everything over to someone close to you than to an obscure character who just wants to make a profit at your expense." Elizabeth raised her tearful eyes to the assistant, looking at him as if her whole life depended on his words. She was so depressed and frightened that she was unable to think straight. Ben had caught the boss by surprise at a moment when she was as happy and relaxed as possible. The news of the impending setup had stunned her. That's what the man was counting on. At any other moment, the girl would have realized that this was some kind of divorce. But now she didn't see the illogic and inconsistency in his words. "You can sign everything over to your parents or to your next of kin," Ben reasoned. "Or someone you trust. Maybe someone from the company?" "You know very well that I have no parents, No brothers, no sisters, Elizabeth answered him. She thought Ben was alluding to himself, but he might not have counted on it because Elizabeth couldn't trust him at that moment. She continued to hold Christopher's hand and suddenly realized, I'll sign the company over to my husband now, she said. That won't arouse suspicion. But the husband is also a close relative, Ben said. Elizabeth looked at Christopher and asked him if he would be willing to take on that responsibility. Ben looked displeased. He was clearly expecting the company to go to him. Christopher didn't answer anything, just froze in one pose, as if he wanted to avoid being noticed. Either I go to prison, Elizabeth said. But if your husband doesn't want to be involved in your affairs, we can think about it, Ben added uncertainly. He agrees, Elizabeth said without looking at the assistant. Well, I guess he does, Christopher said uncertainly. It's like I don't have a choice. I will prepare all the documents and come to your house tomorrow to sign them, Ben said quickly. The assistant congratulated Elizabeth and Christopher on their anniversary, wished them a good evening, and hurried away. At last he looked very intently at Christopher. The man could not decipher the emotion that lurked in his gaze. A calm and happy continuation of the evening was out of the question. Elizabeth didn't bother to give her gift. The next morning Ben came even earlier than Elizabeth, and Christopher had time to clean up. The aide had to wait, and at breakfast they sat down together at the table. I thought a lot about what you said last night, Elizabeth said while Ben was preparing the papers. She had indeed thought about what the assistant had told her, but she didn't analyze his words. Didn't try to find a setup. Elizabeth was thinking about exactly how she could avoid the consequences. It seemed to her that simply transferring the company to her husband was not enough. Christopher and I should probably get a divorce, she said. Christopher immediately rose from his seat. Ben darted his eyes at his boss. So what do you think? Do you think the IRS employs fools? Elizabeth reasoned. They won't realize we just redid the paperwork when they smell something fishy. If we're divorced, there'll be fewer questions. Don't worry and don't do anything rash, Ben cautioned Elizabeth. First of all, we'll do it retroactively. Secondly, we need it more for the competitor than for verification. After all, he wants to deal with you specifically, not your case. Liz. I don't like this, said Christopher, who had just been standing there. I'm definitely not getting a divorce. Elizabeth sighed, waving her hand. Give me your papers, she said. Doomedly, she leafed through a couple of documents, but more for the sake of appearances, she didn't even read what was written there. She had no reason not to trust Ben. They'd been working together for years. The documents are signed. The assistant put everything in a folder and promised to straighten everything out. Expect my call with good news, Ben said. Elizabeth thanked him and finally touched her cup of coffee, which had already managed to become cold. By evening, it had come to Elizabeth's attention that she hadn't gotten herself a copy of the paperwork, that the whole thing was kind of weird in general. In short, Elizabeth began to realize that she had made a mistake. She quickly grabbed her phone and texted her assistant to bring or courier her a copy of the contract. You don't look well at all, said Christopher, who was suddenly at Elizabeth's side. I suggest you have a glass of your favorite wine and calm down. He took out a bottle and a glass, quickly filled it, and handed it to his wife. Elizabeth took the drink, thanking him. She stared at one point and thought about something of her own. I think I did the stupidest thing of my life today, she said quietly and took a sip. You're just nervous, aren't you? Christopher tried to reassure her. You've been thinking about it all day, so you've been having strange thoughts. Have some wine, lie down and rest. Today is done, and tomorrow there will be other things to do. New worries, fresh thoughts. Elizabeth asked Christopher to sit down next to her. As soon as he lowered himself onto the couch, the girl laid her head on his shoulder. She was swollen from just one sip, immediately pulled to sleep. You're right. I'm so tired that I don't know what I'm thinking. My eyes are closing, Elizabeth said. Don't fight it, Christopher said, stroking her head. You need to rest. You didn't sleep much the night before. You've been on edge all day today, so take care of yourself. Elizabeth relaxed in the warm embrace of her lover, took a couple more sips, set the glass on the small table near the sofa, then returned her head to her husband's shoulder and gradually slid into his lap. Christopher continued to stroke Elizabeth's hair and tell her that everything would be all right. He was scared himself, but he held on for the sake of keeping Elizabeth from worrying even more. Someone had to keep a cool head. Elizabeth hadn't opened her eyes yet, but she already realized something was wrong. Her head ached as if she had emptied several bottles of wine last night instead of just a few sips. She didn't want to open her eyes, so Elizabeth decided to sleep a little longer. She rolled over onto her other side and froze. She realized she wasn't in her own bed because she felt a huge, hard pillow under her head. It was like the one her grandmother had in the village. Elizabeth had always thought it weighed 50 pounds and could kill someone if she wanted to. In her house, there were no such pillows in any bedroom. No sofa could have such a thing. Her cheek was stabbed and feathery, and that feeling, too, was from a distant childhood. Elizabeth remembered perfectly well how unpleasant it was to show the sharp tips of feathers through pillowcases, and she would pull them out of the fabric and examine them. And Granny would scold every time she found a pile of those feathers and fluff under the bed. Elizabeth still risked opening her eyes. She couldn't lie there forever and avoid reality. The room was dusky, but there was a glimpse of sunlight through the thick curtains, indicating that the time had definitely passed the afternoon. The girl did not realize where she was. She couldn't see the room, only a thin line of light from the window, which showed dust particles flying around the room. Elizabeth got out of bed, sliding the curtains open. Outside the window, she saw a wooden fence and a lot of bushes of some kind. It felt like she was at a country house or in a village. She even thought she heard cows mooing somewhere in the distance. Elizabeth slowly turned around in the room and guessed from the furnishings that she had actually found herself in an incomprehensible way in a poor village cottage. The room contained the bed from which the girl had risen a few minutes ago, a stove, a table with a white tablecloth, and a closet. Elizabeth did not understand anything. Never before had she been in this place. How had she ended up here in the first place? The last thing Elizabeth remembered from last night was sitting on the couch with a glass of wine and her husband Christopher beside her. There was no way she could have drunk so much to completely forget everything. Elizabeth didn't have her ID or phone with her. She stayed in the homemade clothes she had been wearing yesterday. How she had gotten to this place was unclear, but one thing was clear: she had to go home. Elizabeth walked towards the exit. When she left the room, she found herself in the kitchen, which was also a hallway. Near the door, she noticed her suitcase, immediately opened it. Inside were several things that someone had hastily left. They were not folded, they were lying in a heap. In a separate pocket lay a passport and a few other documents. Very interesting, Elizabeth stretched out. Did I run away from home or something? Apparently something happened yesterday that made me run away from home. But I couldn't reconstruct the events of the previous day at all. All I remembered was the evening by the fireplace, my head on Christopher's shoulder, and the glass in front of me. I only took a couple sips. There was no way that amount of alcohol could have caused my memory loss. Elizabeth rummaged through more of her suitcase, hoping to find a cell phone there. But there was nothing there. Without that gadget, the girl certainly wouldn't run. She couldn't imagine her life without a smartphone at all. Elizabeth stepped outside. The sunlight hurt her eyes, which were used to semi-darkness. The girl put her palm to her forehead to cover herself a little from the sun and looked around. There were several other huts nearby, as poor and dilapidated as the one in which she had awakened. Some of the huts were definitely abandoned, but the closest one was clearly inhabited. And suddenly Elizabeth noticed an old woman sitting on a bench in the yard of a neighboring house. The girl decided that she could help her. In fact, Elizabeth was very happy when she saw someone alive in the middle of nowhere. She immediately ran up to her neighbor. As she got closer, Elizabeth discovered that the neighbor was not the infirm old woman she had thought she was at first sight. It was just that she was dressed in a very rustic way that gave age. "How do you do?" Elizabeth said. "I apologize for disturbing you, but could you tell me where I am and how I came to be here?" The neighbor looked at her carefully. The woman's eyes were so pale, as if transparent. She seemed to know something, but she was in no hurry to tell. "My name is Elizabeth," she introduced herself, thinking it would help her to make the old woman feel at ease. "She's alive," after all, the neighbor suddenly said, which completely disconcerted Elizabeth. "I saw them bringing you in yesterday. I thought they were trying to close the crime. I almost called the police. But there's no cell phone service here." Elizabeth asked the woman to tell her what she'd seen, and then remembered to get the stranger's name. "My name is Mary Adams," the neighbor replied. "I suffer from insomnia. I couldn't sleep last night, and then I heard something. It was late at night. A car came to the window. The car was parked in front of the neighbor's house," said Mary. "I thought my old lady was coming back. But no. 2 men got out of the car, carried you in their arms, carried you into the house, and drove away." Elizabeth, barely able to stay on her feet, asked Mary to describe the men. "I know it was dark, but can you remember anything? Or the make of the car?" Elizabeth asked, folding her arms across her chest in a gesture of pleading. "I could see clearly. They were shining their headlights so bright that half the village could see them," Mary Adams replied, describing the 2 men who had carried Elizabeth into the house. The girl listened to Mary and could not believe her ears, trying to find some excuses and explanations. She hoped the old woman was wrong after all, but there could be no doubt. After the neighbor described the car, Elizabeth was already sure that her husband and her assistant had brought her here. But how was that possible? Elizabeth didn't even know they knew each other. To her mind, the whole thing was just unthinkable. "Did they talk about anything?" she asked. "I can't tell you that now," Mary Adams replied. "I see well for my age, but I don't hear very well. Not even a little," the old woman said guiltily. It was impossible to hear anything. Elizabeth thanked her neighbor once again, went back to her new home. Mary Adams shouted to her that the house was abandoned, so she could stay there as long as she saw fit. "And you can come and see me. I'm the only one living here," she added. "Thanks, but I'm going into town. By the way, can you tell me how to get there?" Elizabeth stopped and asked. The girl stood at the bus stop and borrowed some money from Mary Adams for transportation. She left her things with her too, because she didn't want to carry a suitcase. All she took with her was her passport. She had to walk to her house, which was in the most remote part of the city. Her cottage was located in a place that was considered elite. It was something like a village for the rich. The only way to get there was with a pass, which Elizabeth didn't have with her, of course. But the guard at the gate let her in for old time's sake. What confused her was that he did so reluctantly. "Peter Stephen, have you already forgotten me for one night?" Elizabeth joked. But all she got in response was the guard's embarrassment and a guilty look. "You will go to the house and find out everything there. I'm forbidden to let you in, and I'll probably get a lot for disobeying orders," Peter replied after a long pause. Elizabeth did not understand anything, although she was beginning to guess. Only yesterday she had signed the papers transferring her business to her husband, and today she had been chased out of the house. The only thing she couldn't understand was why she wasn't allowed in the house. It had nothing to do with the company anymore. Elizabeth rang the bell. At the gate, the door was opened by an unfamiliar man. It was the guard. Elizabeth guessed from the uniform. "This is my house. Let me in," she said calmly. "Not true. "The mistress is home now." The guard answered her. "This is the first time I've ever seen you." "No wonder, since it's the first day you've worked here." Elizabeth laughed nervously. "Get out of my way. I'm the boss." Just then Elizabeth noticed a young girl behind the guard. She was strolling across the courtyard in an icy silk robe. Elizabeth couldn't stand it. She tried to lunge at the imposter, but the guard grabbed the girl and threw her straight to the ground. "What's going on here?" Elizabeth screamed. "I'm in some parallel universe." The girl, who was strolling through the courtyard, noticed the guest, walked smoothly to the gate, and looked at Elizabeth haughtily. "This is my home now," said the stranger, smiling smugly. "And Christopher is mine at last. And you can go wherever you like, but don't set foot here again." So Elizabeth wasn't crazy. It was all Christopher's doing. That was Elizabeth's suspicion, but she couldn't understand why she didn't own the house either. The only place she could find out the truth was in her office. That's where Elizabeth decided to go. She had to walk again, because she didn't even have money for a cab. She was terrified of being kicked out of her own company, but she had to talk to her husband, no matter what it took. She approached the building where her office was located, noticing that the guards had changed there as well. When only he had time to organize all this, the girl wondered. She had already guessed that she wouldn't be allowed in here now either. But she had to talk to Christopher at any cost. She was lucky she saw that her car, which apparently didn't belong to her anymore either, had pulled into the parking lot. Christopher got out of the car, wearing a nice business suit and a very satisfied look on his face. His face showed that he felt he was the ruler of the world. "He's getting into character fast," Elizabeth thought. She ran up to the bridge, jumped on him from behind, and started hitting him on the shoulders, on the head, shouting insults, while the passers-by watched with interest. The guards ran out of the building and took Elizabeth off Christopher's back. The girl, mad with anger, waved her hand at them, saying, "It's okay, he'll sort it out." But as soon as the guard let Elizabeth go, she threw herself at her husband again and began to beat him with her palms. She didn't know how to fight. She just swung her arms left and right, not even looking where she was hitting. One of the guards grabbed her by the waist, and Elizabeth continued to flail her arms and legs like a bug that has fallen on its back and can't turn over. "I understand your anger, but don't embarrass yourself," Christopher said. "Why are you driving my car? Is there a girl walking around in my house?" Elizabeth shouted. "I've already realized that you've taken the company away from me, but what does that have to do with the property?" "You should have read the documents you signed more carefully," Christopher said calmly. Elizabeth froze. She was no longer hysterical. She realized that she had signed over everything to him. She had no chance of getting anything back. "Was your mistress in the house?" she asked with a hint of contempt. "How long have you been with her?" "It doesn't matter," Christopher said. "Get out of here before they force you out. You're free to go. The divorce petition has already been filed." Elizabeth was released. She didn't throw herself. She stayed where she was and just watched her traitorous husband go to her office, where he would run her business, live in her house, and drive her car. She was so stunned by her spouse's insolence and meanness that she couldn't cry or get angry, nothing. And then she noticed Ben coming out of the office. The former assistant was obviously in a great mood, walking almost at a gallop. Elizabeth rushed over to him. "Why did you do that?" she asked, grabbing Ben by his jacket. He was scared. He hadn't expected to see his former boss. He tried to say something, but he couldn't get a complete sentence out of his mouth out of excitement. He said he didn't know anything, that it was all Christopher's plan, and he wasn't lying about the tests. They were indeed planned. "How could you not know when you brought me documents to sign that said I was giving my husband all my assets? Did you deliberately frame your speeches to confuse me as much as possible? To panic me?" I really didn't know. They slipped me the wrong papers. Ben continued to lie. He brought me into the house. Elizabeth came by with Christopher. Did the neighbor see you? Stop lying to me. You set this whole thing up together. By the way, why don't I remember anything? Guilt. I was interrupted. Ben lowered his eyes. He realized that there was no point in lying anymore. His complicity in this crime was obvious. And then behind the man's back, some girl screamed. Oh, brother. Elizabeth recognized that voice at once. It was that thin, gentle voice that had told her hours ago that she was no longer welcome in the house. Ben's face showed that he was not happy with the situation. He didn't want his former boss to know his motives for this deception. So that's what this is all about, Elizabeth said when she saw the girl. It's your sister. Have you taken care of the family welfare? Elizabeth, you were told to leave. Go on your way, Ben said when he realized there was no point in hiding anymore. You can't prove anything. If you go to the police, they'll send you straight to forensics. Elizabeth didn't understand. What kind of examination would they send her to? But Ben quickly explained to her that she had blacked out the day before for a reason. The girl had already guessed that something had been spiked in her wine, and the assistant confirmed it. The police have been alerted to your case. Unless you want to end your days in a mental institution or behind bars, you'd better not go to the police, Ben warned her. You've done your homework, Elizabeth said through gritted teeth, clenching her fists. Ben's sister, Sandy, hid behind him because she saw Elizabeth's fighting spirit, but her brother reassured her. Sandy, don't worry. She won't have time to hurt you. The guards are already on standby, he said. Elizabeth decided to take her almost ex-husband's advice and not embarrass herself anymore. She walked Ben and her sister to the door and then kicked her former assistant's car with all her might. Security guards immediately ran out of the office, and Elizabeth rushed out. She stopped when she had run out of strength and there was no pursuit. Elizabeth was literally gasping for breath. She had never run so much and so fast before. If she could escape from the guards, she could not escape from her own thoughts. Elizabeth realized that through her own stupidity and carelessness, she had lost everything she had earned and accumulated through years of hard work. Elizabeth sobbed. She sat upright on the ground, leaning her back against some unremarkable stall. "Girl, are you scaring my customers like this?" said the indignant stall clerk, who had been listening to Elizabeth crying and mumbling to herself for a long time. But when the woman saw Elizabeth, her mood changed. She realized that the poor girl was in trouble. She could tell by the crying. But Elizabeth looked decent, so she was trustworthy. The woman even asked if Elizabeth needed any help. "If it is not difficult to borrow $3 from me for a ticket to the village," said the girl. "I'm asking for a loan. When I have the money, I will definitely pay you back." "Take one," said the woman and handed Elizabeth a bill. "We'll pay it back, or we won't. That's another matter. At least you can buy yourself something to eat." Elizabeth was also ashamed to accept the handout, but she was in no position to refuse it. She promised herself that she would be sure to pay back Mary Adams, who had given her money for her journey from the village. With that saleswoman, she was sure she would find a way out of the hole she had fallen into through her own gullibility and foolishness. Elizabeth returned to the village. She didn't know where else to go. She had no place in the city in which to find shelter, and here some of her belongings remained, and at least one acquaintance who was willing to take in and help was sweet old Mary Adams. "Yes, the boys are very brazen these days," Mrs. Adams said, listening to Elizabeth's story of how she came to be in this village. The girl had bought the cheapest waffles and cake for her neighbor to thank her for her help. They sat in the kitchen drinking tea. Mary Adams was thinking about how she could help the unfortunate girl, and Elizabeth was thinking about how she could get out of her plight. Though she was engaged in business, she had failed to make any useful connections. The girl did not participate in dubious schemes, did not give bribes, so she could not agree with anyone. The partners did not care who ran her company, she herself or her ex-husband. Mary offered Elizabeth to stay the night at her house, but Elizabeth declined. She felt that she had already squeezed the woman too much. There was no light in the house Christopher and Ben had put her in, but Elizabeth didn't need it. She lit a candle she'd also borrowed from a neighbor. It was enough. It seemed to Elizabeth that she would not be able to sleep and would think about her problems all night. But her strength left her, and she fell asleep as soon as she put her head on the pillow. In the morning, Elizabeth decided to make some improvements to her new home. There was no telling how long she would have to spend here. She wanted to create some semblance of comfort. For the first time, she noticed the decoration of the room. The house seemed to have been abandoned not too long ago. Dust had already accumulated on the shelves, but it didn't look like it had been there for years. In the kitchen drawers, there were still packets of pasta, cereal with expiration dates that hadn't expired. The first thing Elizabeth did was dust. She decided to find a rag and suddenly noticed a note in the most prominent place in front of the front door. She assumed it was a message from her ex-husband to her. With trembling hands, she took the note, began to read it, and from the very first line she realized that the letter was not meant for her. It began with the words, "My dear daughter." Her mother had died a long time ago. She couldn't have left a note for her. But Elizabeth didn't stop reading. The letter was from the woman who owned the house to her daughter. She apologized to her, hoping that her daughter might remember her one day, maybe decide to visit. But the former owner of the house had moved away. She gave her daughter an address where she could find her, begged her to come visit her mother. Elizabeth wiped away the tear that rolled down her cheek after reading the message. So much maternal love and pain in those words written in pencil with a trembling hand. The girl wondered what had happened between mother and daughter that they had to separate and cut off contact for several years. Elizabeth could learn the truth from only one person, so she went to him. "I've been waiting for you," Mary Adams exclaimed joyfully when she saw Elizabeth on the doorstep. "I wanted to come to you to ask you to breakfast." The woman didn't seem to be lying. Her table was indeed already set. Fragrant tea, luscious cakes, pancakes, and cottage cheese. Mary Adams must have gotten up very early to prepare a treat for her new acquaintance. Elizabeth even blushed with embarrassment. "Why do you trouble yourself so much?" Elizabeth was modest. "I'm so embarrassed that I barged into your life." "I'm only glad you did," Mary Adams replied animatedly. "I'm all alone with no grandchildren or children. My neighbor left me. It's good to have you here. I feel sorry for you, though. It's not good for you at all." Mary, a little embarrassed by the last sentence, remembered how Elizabeth had cried the day before and worried that she had lost everything she had. But Elizabeth was not offended. On the contrary, she even smiled. "By the way, I wanted to ask you about your previous neighbor." Elizabeth remembered, sitting down at the table, and the dishes gave off such an appetizing aroma that she wanted to start breakfast as soon as possible. Lucy lived in that house. Immediately the memories rushed back to her mind. Mary Adams was a good womankind. She hadn't been gone that long, not even a year. Lucy and her daughter were unlucky. Did they fight a lot? A lot. "That's interesting to me," Elizabeth said and put the note on the table. Mary put on her glasses, picked up the letter, ran her eyes over it quickly. After reading it, she put her glasses back on the table and looked out the window. She seemed to have tears in her eyes as well. Because of such foolishness, frankly, they feared, Mary said after a long pause. Elizabeth had already managed to whip up a couple of pancakes in the meantime. Catherine is Lucy's daughter. She found a young man in town who wasn't young at all and was about 15 years older, probably, but rich. Lucy did not accept such a son-in-law. They called her daughter all sorts of names, but she and her fiancé come to visit together. That was the last time Catherine visited her mother, and she told her not to show her face here. Elizabeth set aside the pies and pancakes, listened intently to the story. The girl had lost her mother early. She couldn't imagine how one could choose a groom between a fiancé and a family member. Elizabeth could not condemn either mother or daughter. It seemed to her that a compromise should have been made, but it was easy to reason when the situation didn't concern you. Anyway, after a few months, Lucy regretted everything she'd said. The daughter did not answer the phone and did not come to visit. Finish the story, Mary Adams. And then Lucy decided to move to the city. Hoped that at least there she will have the opportunity to meet with her daughter. But where Catherine went, she didn't know. So now I don't know if they ever met. Somehow I'm dying to know, Elizabeth said suddenly. I have the address. I'll go and ask. And at the same time I'll confess that I've taken over her house. Elizabeth was telling the truth. The thought occurred to her as soon as she read the letter. She wanted to hug the poor woman and feel sorry for her. But she didn't have enough money for the journey. The town was farther away from the village than the one Elizabeth lived in. Therefore, the ticket would cost more. But Mary Adams offered to help her again. Elizabeth was embarrassed, but she would not refuse. The girl was still sure that she would not be in this predicament forever. One day she would have the opportunity to pay back everyone who was helping her. Elizabeth went to Lucy's the next morning. She was ready to go earlier, but the bus left only once a day in the early morning. The girl wondered on the way what she would say to the woman, why she had even considered this trip. But the bus was already pulling up to the train station. It was too late to change her mind. It took Elizabeth about 2 hours to find the right address. And now she stood in front of the door to Lucy's apartment. She tentatively pressed the bell, but it didn't work. Elizabeth already thought that this was a sign that she should go back to the village and continue to think about her own problems, and not solve other people's. But no, she hadn't come all this way just to be scared and come back with nothing. Elizabeth still didn't know why she had come here in the first place or what she would say. But she knocked on the door. No one opened, though Elizabeth knocked several times, and for quite a while. She even thought she heard footsteps outside the door, but no one ever opened. Just as Elizabeth turned around, there was a thud in the apartment, as if something or someone had fallen. There was no doubt about it, the sound came from behind the door behind her. Elizabeth couldn't leave, so she risked opening the door to see if anything was wrong in the apartment and if she needed help. The knob came down and the lock opened. Elizabeth pushed the door open and immediately saw a woman on the floor in the hallway. She seemed to be having a stroke. The girl was frightened. She didn't even have a cell phone to call an ambulance. But Lucy pointed to the kitchen. Elizabeth immediately went where the woman showed her and saw a smartphone on the table. The ambulance came 10 minutes later. Elizabeth went with Lucy to the hospital, spent about an hour in the corridor until the doctor came out to her. "She's fine," the doctor said. "You called the paramedics just in time." Elizabeth breathed a sigh of relief, and then the doctor said that they had already spoken to the patient's daughter. They told her that an unknown girl had come to the hospital. Catherine said she'd be here within the hour. She asked you to wait for her, the doctor said. "I'll wait for her," the doctor said. "I'll wait for her," Elizabeth replied calmly. She had nowhere to be in a hurry. She thought it would be a great opportunity to reconcile mother and daughter. She was even glad that Katie had decided to come after all. She didn't ignore her mother's problems. So it wasn't too late. Katie arrived quickly, less than an hour later. She ran straight to Elizabeth and knelt down in front of her. "Don't be. That's what anyone in my position would do," Elizabeth said, embarrassed. "The doctor said you saved Mom's life," Katie said, getting up from her knees. "I don't know who you are or how you know my mom, but I'm grateful to you. Ask for anything you want." "Come on, I don't need anything. Will you forgive your mother?" Elizabeth said, and handed her the letter she had found in the house. "I didn't go to your mother's house of my own free will. There was this note. "It was meant for you, I take it?" Catherine took the sheet, read her mother's message, which had been waiting for almost a year in her home. She couldn't hold back her tears as she read the words written in neat handwriting. Elizabeth noticed the look of guilt, shame, and unspeakable pain in Katie's eyes. "How could I have forgotten about her? She could have died alone," Katie said, sinking down on the bench beside Elizabeth. "But how did you end up in her house and apartment?" The doctor reported that Mama had been taken from the city apartment, not the village. Elizabeth was ashamed to admit that she had moved into Lucy's house without her knowledge. But she saw Kathy as a good and kind person who would certainly not judge her. So Elizabeth decided to tell her the whole story from the beginning, so that Katie would have no more questions for her. "It was an accident of fate," Catherine said when Elizabeth had finished her story. "Stay the night at your mother's in the village. You can't leave tonight anyway, and she will be in the hospital for weeks. Tomorrow morning I will come to visit you and we will talk." Elizabeth thanked the kind girl. She really hadn't thought at all about where she would stay. The buses traveled once a day, not only to the city but also from the city. So she could either walk to the village, which would take her a long time, or take a cab, which Elizabeth simply didn't have the money for. Catherine not only allowed her mother's savior to stay with her, but drove her to the familiar driveway. "I'll be there at 9, Katie said goodbye. "I hope you won't be asleep by then." Elizabeth re-entered the apartment she had been in for only a few minutes. She found it cozy, but everything about it suggested that it belonged to a lonely and deeply unhappy woman. There were many framed photographs on the shelves. Each picture was of Catherine at a different time in her life. On one was a baby, on another a first grader with puffy brows, on the third already a graduate in a beautiful ball gown. Lucy loved her daughter and missed her in a strange apartment. It wasn't easy for Elizabeth to get comfortable. She had to get used to the idea that she had no corner of her own now. The girl thought a lot about Catherine, what she wanted to talk to her about, but there was no point in guessing. The only thing left to do was to wait until morning to see if Catherine had been deceived. Catherine knocked on the door at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. Elizabeth was surprised that the girl knocked. She was not the mistress of the house, so Catherine could have entered her house unannounced. But Elizabeth even asked permission to enter and clarified exactly where they could set up to talk. "Mother is feeling better and would like to thank you," Catherine said as she sat down at the table in the kitchen. Elizabeth poured tea, but there was nothing else she could offer her guest. She even took the tea bag without asking. "If you don't mind, we'll go to the hospital after we talk," Catherine said. "Of course, I also have to thank your mother after all to get to know her. I'm her lodger." It turned out that Catherine was floundering, did not know how to get to what she wanted to talk about. Elizabeth guessed that Lucy wasn't the topic of conversation. "I remember you telling me your story yesterday," Catherine began to say. "You were running a successful business, and I found some articles about you on the internet. It's amazing that a businesswoman like you could be so foolishly deceived." "I trusted both Ben and my husband," Elizabeth replied, feeling an inexplicable sense of guilt. "I was just intimidated and confused. They were people I didn't expect to be set up at all." "Don't think I'm trying to shame you or make fun of you," Catherine said, as she realized that her words might have sounded like mockery. "Quite the opposite. I would like to discuss some details with you. I have a proposition for you that you'll like, especially given the position you're in." Elizabeth raised her head and squared her shoulders. Her whole appearance showed that she was ready to listen to the terms and offers. Catherine immediately saw in front of her a strong woman, a real businesswoman. Until then, Elizabeth seemed to her as a lost girl. But her ex-husband and assistant could not bury in her a confident businesswoman. "I wasn't, and I'll be honest about it," Catherine said. Before voicing her proposal, or even a request, Catherine told the backstory. She admitted that she married a man who was 18 years older than her, Mary Adams got it a little wrong, but she entered into marriage for love. Catherine also revealed that this was the reason why she and her mom had a fight. Elizabeth was silent about the fact that she was already aware that she was the cause of discord between mother and daughter. 2 months ago, my husband passed away, Catherine said sadly. No sooner had I recovered from this loss, although not yet, to be honest, as I had to face a new problem, the heirs. Other than our mutual son, only 3 years old, my spouse had no children. His business has passed to me. But I don't understand anything about it. I am afraid that I too could be cheated by assistants and accountants and other employees. Anybody could set me up because I don't understand anything about the paperwork. So I would be very happy if you would become my right hand. Teach me how to run the business and help me get the company out. Because with me at the helm, my late husband's company is going downhill. Elizabeth was pleased that Catherine had decided to entrust her with such a responsible task, even knowing that she herself was dressed like a little girl. She even asked Catherine if she was embarrassed by that fact. Not at all, Catherine replied calmly. You've been running a successful business for several years. I read that you built your company from scratch. Why can't you promote an established and successful business? Personal motives played into your business. You were deceived by people close to you. I have a different situation. I'd be happy to help you. Elizabeth agreed. Catherine hugged her new acquaintance, thanked her for this answer, offered Elizabeth to immediately give an advance payment so that she could rent an apartment, settle in for the first time, buy food, new clothes. After the conversation, the girls went to Lucy's hospital, where the woman tearfully thanked Elizabeth for saving her life. But she was even more grateful for reconciling with her daughter. After her first day of work, which was Elizabeth's abbreviated day, she drove to the village. The purpose of the trip was one thing: to talk to Mary Adams, to settle her debts. Elizabeth couldn't even figure out what Mary Adams was happier about: the fact that her new neighbor had done well and found a job, or that Lucy had reconciled with her daughter. The woman did not want to accept money from Elizabeth, but she said she would be offended and would not forgive herself if Mary did not accept her debt. Elizabeth also wanted to visit the stall clerk, who was also kind to her. But she had to go to another town for that, not the one where she had settled. Now she didn't want to spend half a day on the bus, so Elizabeth decided that she would thank her when she bought a car. By the way, she was able to do so after 6 months. All in all, in the entire 6 months, Elizabeth had almost completely recovered from her collapse. She became not just an assistant and business consultant for Catherine, she became the second person in her company. The girls were able to not only save the business, but powerfully propel it forward. Catherine was well aware that without Elizabeth's help she could not have done it, and therefore generously thanked the girl with a high salary. Elizabeth had not lost her entrepreneurial spirit. She tried not to waste a lot of money. After she bought an apartment and a car, she started saving for her own business. It was not the first time she started from scratch. She'd already managed to start a business once and create a successful construction firm. So she would do it again. It took the girl 3 years to get back on her feet. She was still a long way from her previous fortune, but last time it had taken her years to get her business off the ground. Now, however, things were progressing much faster. Elizabeth did not forget Mary Adams and the saleswoman, who had been kind to her. She had paid off the second one too, and they had even managed to chat. The woman at the stall was named Tatiana, and she told her that she was deeply unhappy. Her own son had died in a hot spot, and she was all alone. Elizabeth had no idea how many lonely women there were in the world. She thought about the fact that there was no one to take care of them. For example, Mary Adams complained that she herself had to chop wood for the winter, shovel snow, go for water. It is not good for an old woman to do such hard labor. When Elizabeth had her own business and money, she thought about creating a foundation. The girl found volunteers who agreed to help old people and single women with hard physical labor on a free basis. The news of such a fund quickly spread around the city. Elizabeth was even interviewed for the regional channel. Christopher got up early to prepare for the meeting. The company wasn't doing as well as Elizabeth. He was nervous. The partners were refusing to cooperate. If at first no one cared who was at the helm of Elizabeth's company, after a while they realized that there was a difference. Christopher had never been a businessman, and things were not going well for him. He couldn't get organized on one level of his company. There was no way Ben could single-handedly pull the firm off the bottom, and so far they were still afloat. But the outlook for the next few years was bleak. Added to the fact that Christopher not only didn't know how to earn money, he spent it recklessly. And he had an assistant in the form of Sandy. This young beauty didn't worry about money at all. The money from her card, and consequently from Christopher's accounts, flew away like leaves from trees in the fall. Christopher had a habit of eating breakfast with the news. It was a habit he'd had since his days at the car service center. He brewed his coffee, set a plate of freshly cooked scrambled eggs in front of him, and turned up the volume on the TV. Just as he took the first sip of the aromatic, invigorating coffee, the drink immediately spurted out in a fountain onto the table. The thing was, he saw a familiar face on the TV. Elizabeth, in an expensive suit, beautifully styled and wearing expensive jewelry, was talking about her charitable foundation. She was definitely doing well. After the interview, the announcer talked about how Elizabeth is a successful entrepreneur and is already moving the local rich people from the top position. How is that possible? I ripped her off. Christopher said out loud, "If a man has brains, he is not lost in the world," said Sandy, who had just woken up to the smell of coffee. "That can't be said for you." Christopher was furious when he heard his lover's words. He reminded her that she wasn't exactly frugal either, and had contributed significantly to their ruin. "I thought you were going to be a businessman," she said unashamedly. "Money is supposed to work and multiply itself, and for some reason you have only disadvantages. You should learn from your ex." The man could not stand such insults and obvious mockery from the girl, grabbed her by the hair and pushed her out into the street right in her pajamas. She shrieked, begging to be let go, but Christopher couldn't stop. She had hurt him too much with her remarks. Christopher was already thinking that his mistress had stopped seeing boundaries. More than once she had made insulting remarks about Christopher, especially if she didn't have enough money for new jewelry or dresses. Sandy could only demand and judge. It was impossible to get support and help from her. "Come to my place and get your sister out of here," Christopher told Ben over the phone. "What do you mean, take her away?" Ben didn't understand. "Literally, I don't need her anymore. I'm going back to my wife. And Sandy's standing outside the fence in her pajamas. And the longer you drive, the longer she'll have to walk down the street in God's pajamas." Christopher replied and hung up the phone. He wasn't joking or speaking in haste. He really intended to get Elizabeth back. He couldn't handle the business alone. The money would soon run out, and Elizabeth was obviously doing well. He thought that his ex-wife would immediately forgive him and take him back. All the more reason for him to return everything to her, provided she agreed to remarry him. Before leaving for another city, Christopher thought that Ben might harm him in some way. So he decided to fire the assistant and informed him about it by phone. "You realize that without me, the end of your empire will come even faster." Ben answered him, who was also furious that his sister had been thrown out on the street like an unwanted kitten. "Don't worry, my ex-wife will fix my affairs," Christopher answered, starting the engine. "She would have fired you anyway. No one would want to work with a traitor." He hung up. Ben looked at his sister, who still couldn't get warm in the car. Did he seriously think Elizabeth would forgive him and welcome him back with open arms? Sandy asked through gritted teeth. "No, of course not. She's not stupid," Ben told her. "But we can try to gain her trust and punish the bastard." What city does she live in now? Did you see it on the news? Sandy nodded. Ben smiled and stepped on the gas. He and his sister are going to Elizabeth's place too. Just need to change their sister's clothes first. Ben decided that the mistress shouldn't be taken to see Elizabeth. She would be more able to confide in him without her. Sandy didn't insist. She didn't feel like traveling across town, but she advised her brother to call Elizabeth, because Christopher would definitely be there sooner. Elizabeth enjoyed the beautiful morning. Even though it was getting close to lunchtime, she'd given herself a chance to get some sleep that day. She and Catherine had had a party the night before to celebrate a successful transaction. The peaceful flow of the morning routine was broken by a phone call. Elizabeth had hoped to hear anyone but the man who had left her in the lurch a few years ago. "Ben?" Elizabeth said questioningly. "Did you get the wrong number?" "No. I want to warn you that another man from the past is coming to see you soon," the man said seriously, though his knees were trembling with excitement. "Your ex-husband has found out you're back on the horse and wants to suck on your income. Christopher himself couldn't replicate your success. He's almost out of money." Elizabeth replied that's what she thought. But Ben is worried for nothing. The girl would never forgive her ex-husband in her life, would never believe him. "I understand that." Unlike him, he laughed. "You want to get back at him, don't you? I have an idea." "I'm not surprised you have another plan to trick a man." Elizabeth's former assistant jabbed at him as well. "What I don't understand is, why would you want to do that? I mean, you two are kind of related, and even related." And Ben told him what Christopher had done to him and his sister. So he had a strong motive for revenge, too. Elizabeth still agreed to listen to his plan. She found his arguments convincing. Elizabeth was also attracted to the fact that this time her safety would not be threatened. So this wasn't another scheme to take everything away from her. Elizabeth was even looking forward to hearing from her ex-husband. There was no way Christopher could think of a way for him to show up. He wanted to make sure his ex-spouse didn't guess his intentions, as if he didn't know she was rich again. Christopher tracked Elizabeth down, finding out where she lived and worked. As if by chance, he found himself in the same establishment where Elizabeth got her coffee every morning. "What meeting?" Christopher exclaimed, meeting Elizabeth there. Yes, unexpected indeed, Elizabeth played along, who had long known that her husband was tracking her. The guards had already reported to her a few days ago that a man was following her. Christopher asked Elizabeth how she was doing, telling her that he was doing fine except for his love life. "Wow, your mistress only wanted money." Elizabeth ironically repeated after him. "Is this boomerang coming back to you?" "It's not true, I wasn't with you for money." Christopher answered her resentfully. "Ben and his little sister tricked me. She seduced me, and he put me up to it." Elizabeth nodded, looking understanding. It looked very exaggerated, and Christopher could see the obvious mockery on his ex-wife's part. Nevertheless, he was pleased that she did not stop talking to him, listened immediately, and even entered into a dialogue. All of this Elizabeth had done deliberately. She needed to gain his trust so that Christopher would think she had fallen for his bait again. And she succeeded. After the first meeting, Christopher was sure that after a couple more conversations and dates, he would be a rich woman's husband again. And Elizabeth was happy to play along. Each time she forced herself to communicate with her ex-husband, but she realized that without it, her revenge would not happen. She needed to feign trust and warmth toward a man she couldn't stand. Listening to Christopher's words was simply unbearable for her. She realized that he was a masterful liar, and believe her, he really wanted to deceive. Even though she knew that every word he said was a lie. Christopher was getting more and more turned on because he couldn't tell if Elizabeth trusted him or not. It seemed to him that everything was happening too easily. Immediately, his ex-wife agreed to a date, answered his phone instantly. Was she so starved for a relationship, so lonely that she forgave him so easily? Christopher went on the offensive, sending her gifts, arranging surprises, dates. He thought she was about to melt. Elizabeth stepped over herself when she went to these meetings and smiled sweetly at her traitor husband. She was even more disgusted when she saw Christopher cowering before her, the bastard squealing. "Ben, I'm getting tired of these meetings with my ex-husband. When do we move on to the next phase of the plan?" Elizabeth asked him after another date. "We need to push Christopher into action. Until he's ready to give it all back to you, we're not going to get anywhere," Ben told her. "How do you push him to do that?" "I'm already pretending to be in love and forgiving all the wrongs," Elizabeth clarified. Next to Elizabeth at that moment was Catherine. She came to visit her to discuss personal matters. The girls had become not only business partners, but also best friends. "I have an idea," Catherine said suddenly. Elizabeth immediately put the call on speaker so that Ben could hear her. Men are most afraid of competition. If Christopher found out that Elizabeth had a suitor for his heart, he would immediately move into decisive action. Ben agreed that it was a good idea. As a man, he confirmed it. Katie then informed him that she had a good acquaintance who would agree to help her. Christopher didn't know how to propose to Elizabeth himself. He still doubted that she had finally forgiven him. Suddenly, he received a call on his work phone. Since Ben had been fired, Christopher scheduled all negotiations and meetings by himself. He received a call from a man who introduced himself as a well-known investor, and Christopher knew his name. It was a man named David. This was a weighty figure in their field. Many people knew him, and everyone dreamed of working with this man. Christopher even straightened his back, although the person on the phone still couldn't see him. Christopher prepared for the meeting with the investor as carefully as for a date. Until the last moment, he didn't believe that the David he had in mind would come to the meeting. But his expectations were justified. After a short negotiation, the businessmen shook hands, but David was in no hurry to leave. "Is it true that Elizabeth Agorevna is your ex-wife?" David suddenly asked. Christopher nodded and immediately tensed. This question did not bode well. David said that a friend of his was interested in the woman. "He begged me to find out if Elizabeth had a boyfriend," David said, blushing. "I'm sorry to bring it up." "That's all right," Christopher coughed. "It's good of you to ask. Elizabeth and I are discussing the possibility of starting a family right now. I want to propose to her because our feelings are back." "That's too bad, because my friend was going to take her out tonight," David said. "But then I'll tell him he has nothing to look forward to." "Yes, please do." Christopher's voice became high, like a frightened boy's. Christopher waited until David left the restaurant and immediately called Elizabeth, asking her not to plan anything for the evening. He had a serious conversation to have. Wow, that worked so fast. Elizabeth was surprised. She knew at once that Christopher had prepared a serious conversation. He had dressed like a real groom, prepared a huge bouquet, and was very excited. Elizabeth sank into a chair and showed that she was ready to listen to him. Christopher pulled some papers out of his briefcase, got down on one knee, and handed Elizabeth the ring. "I want it all back," he said, to prove that he was serious. "I have prepared the documents that will give you everything back, everything that I took away. You will be my wife again." Elizabeth did not hurry to take the ring, open the folder with the documents, read them carefully, every line, every word. When she was sure that this time there was no deceit, she put her signature in the right places. "When did you have time to prepare them?" She was surprised. "But I was on my way to you with them," Christopher said. "You can see the date I wrote and signed them. It shows that I'm serious." While Elizabeth read the papers, Christopher remained on one knee with his arm outstretched. He was very worried. But since the girl signed the papers, then the deed is done. "It's a shame that you're giving me back much less than you took," Elizabeth began to say. And Christopher immediately realized that he was too happy too soon. and I gave you the company in a very different state of mind. But thank you for that. You can offer your ring to Sandy. I don't need anything else from you, if that's what it takes. I'll make a deal with the police, just like you did. I was wiser this time. Elizabeth took the folder with the documents, got up from the table and left the restaurant. Christopher remained sitting on one knee. He could not believe his ears. He now found himself in Elizabeth's shoes. She had tricked him too. A waiter approached Christopher, asking if he wanted to pay the bill. "What bill?" yelled at the kid, furious. "Didn't you see that? Didn't she just take everything from me? How am I supposed to pay for it?" The waiter was startled by this reaction, but kept his cool. He asked the man to calm down and told him that he would have to call security, and maybe even the police if Christopher didn't pull himself together and pay for his order. But he had no intention of calming down. Christopher was furious. He was realizing more and more every second that he had literally become a tramp. He threw all sorts of unflattering words at Elizabeth, who could no longer hear him. He started smashing everything, breaking chairs, tables, and sweeping dishes from the tables of other visitors. But he was quickly calmed down and tied up by the guards. "Christopher, why did you embarrass yourself like that?" "You are a respectable man," said the owner of the restaurant. While the bound Christopher and the staff waited for the police, the man's words echoed in Christopher's mind. He remembered how, years ago, he had asked Elizabeth to calm down and not embarrass herself by throwing her fists at him in the middle of the street. He could understand her pain now, her feelings. Only the girl was much more hurt and offended. She had been robbed of her hard-earned blood and sweat, and he had been robbed of something that had never belonged to him. It was cold and calculated revenge. And Christopher accepted defeat. He decided that now he would definitely settle down, go back to his car service. He could try on a rich life and realize that money doesn't just fall out of the sky. He had everything, but he couldn't save it. When Elizabeth walked out of the restaurant, she raised the folder above her head and shouted with joy. And in the car already waiting for her was Katie, who immediately ran out of the car, hugged her friend. The girls went to celebrate their victory in the club. On the way to the club, Elizabeth called Ben and told him that the deed was done. Christopher was left with nothing, and she got back all her own. The man was pleased with the outcome, even venturing to ask if Elizabeth would hire him again. "No, I've had enough of this once," Elizabeth laughed. "I am grateful for your help. I can send you some money to thank you and pay you for your work, for warning me, but you can't expect more than that. I'm sorry, once a man has betrayed you, you can't trust him." "Funny enough talk," exclaimed a happy Katie. We were already at the club. Elizabeth said goodbye, hung up the phone, and looked at the huge building with its thousands of lights on. She had never been to such places, but her friend reassured her that it was a decent place and only rich people vacationed there. And their David was waiting for them. Elizabeth did not know about it. She did not even communicate with him. This Catherine agreed about everything with her friend, and the meeting at the club was organized by her at David's request. The man had long been interested in this young, successful businesswoman. He himself was also young and attractive, but had no success in his personal life. All the girls who literally hung around his neck did not seem worthy to him. Many needed money. Their behavior was not distinguished by modesty. And David wanted to find a decent girl, whom he would see as his future wife and mother of his children. Elizabeth seemed to him just like that, and he fell in love with her at first sight. David later admits to Elizabeth that he could hardly hold a conversation with her ex-husband. He disliked liars and cheaters so much, but when he looked at Christopher and realized that this man had caused a lot of pain to this beautiful girl, the urge to punch him in the face was self-inflicted. Catherine didn't bother to tell Elizabeth that David was actually interested in her friend. The girl wasn't sure if her buddy was ready for a relationship. She hadn't promised David anything except that she would introduce them. And the introduction was a success. Elizabeth was in a good mood, smiling, almost bouncing with happiness. And David just couldn't contain his smile as he watched such a happy and therefore even more beautiful Elizabeth. "I owe you one," Elizabeth said happily to David. "How did you manage to convince my ex-husband that I had a boyfriend and he signed everything back over to me the same day?" "Men don't like competition," David answered her with a smile. "But I wasn't lying about your suitor. I do have one." David blushed, but because of the darkness in the club, Elizabeth didn't notice it. The confident, successful man who runs a dozen businesses felt at that moment like a schoolboy shy of talking to a girl. Elizabeth danced and behaved casually, not even realizing that her interlocutor was burning with shame and shaking with embarrassment. "Then introduce me to him. What if this is my destiny?" Elizabeth laughed, who was in a great mood, and said it not seriously, more as a joke. But David literally blossomed before her eyes. When he heard these words, Elizabeth, he began to correct his jacket and hair, and then extended his hand to the girl. Elizabeth stopped dancing at this metamorphosis. She looked at David seriously, trying to determine whether she understood correctly what would happen next. "Then let me introduce myself. I am the admirer," he said with contrived importance. It looked ridiculous again, because the man was terribly shy. He tried to give the impression of a serious man, but his excitement was getting in the way. Elizabeth was confused at this point, but she shook his hand. David was a handsome man, and outwardly Elizabeth was attracted to him. But the girl did not think about serious and non-serious relationships. It seemed to her that after her first marriage she would remain a loner forever. Catherine watched from the side how her friend and old comrade communicate. She really wanted Elizabeth to find her happiness, and she knew for a fact that David was the perfect match. He would definitely not be with Elizabeth for the money. He is a loyal and decent man. Those were the arguments she made to her friend the next day. Elizabeth embarrassed. She too was well aware of what an important and powerful businessman David was. She couldn't believe she could be looked up to by a man of such high rank. "And you're not an ordinary girl," either Katie told her. "There's nothing to be surprised about. Give David a chance, you'll never meet anyone like him again." And Elizabeth heeded her friend's advice. She went on a few dates with David, accepted gifts and advances from him, and eventually they formed a beautiful couple. A year and a half later, Elizabeth and David became a family. Elizabeth did meet Christopher. It was unexpected. She had a flat tire somewhere on the outskirts of town, namely near a tire shop. Elizabeth even laughed that the owners of the tire shop had put something on the road just to get a customer. Never before had there been such an expensive car in this godforsaken place. Unfortunately, the owner's only employee was a half-drunk Christopher. Elizabeth recognized him immediately and said she wouldn't let him near the car. She called David and asked him to come and get her in the car. But while she waited for her husband, she decided to talk to Christopher. He told her without much enthusiasm that he had been working at the place since he was released from the police. After the debauch in the restaurant, he lived in a dormitory, and the only joy in his life was a bottle of vodka. Christopher watched with hatred and envy as Elizabeth got into David's car and they drove off to their happy life. "To each his own," Christopher said, his voice hoarse with hangover. "And we haven't lived rich. There's no reason to start." The wife reluctantly packed her things to leave her husband. But hearing the voices of her husband and mother-in-law, she hid. Carol sat in the stall at her workplace and fell asleep due to the change in weather. She wanted to sleep all the time. The bell rang and a customer appeared near the window. "A scone, please, and 2 poppy seed muffins," the man asked. Carol handed him the purchases and sat back in her seat. Despite such a simple job, she would rather have something physical than sit like this all day, pecking her nose. The customers were good in the morning and from 3 o'clock on, but the rest of the time the woman entertained herself with embroidery or reading books. Carol remembered the 5 years of hard study she had spent at the institute. And now, years later, it turned out that higher education had no meaning for her. After studying, the girl went to work as an engineer at a factory. It closed after 3 years. Carol was disappointed in her future for several years and realized that only in big cities education mattered. The provinces only needed teachers, and for jobs that were distributed in advance to family and friends. Carol didn't stop there. She tried a change of specialty. She finished courses and became a landscape designer. During that period, she met her husband, Daniel. She had high hopes then, which again were not realized. There were few people in the city who were willing to pay specialists to design landscaping projects for plots and gardens. The company promised Carol that they would have projects from the city and possibly the regional administration. But time passed, and apart from the occasional order, nothing happened. Carol urged Daniel to go with her to the regional city, but her fiancé was strongly attached to his parents and didn't want to live in the city. So at almost 32, it seemed to Carol that her life was over. Yes, she married Daniel. They sold Carol's grandmother's old house, added the money given to them as a wedding gift, and took out a loan in her husband's name, as Carol had no official job at the time. Carol's husband did not have a college degree and did not particularly aspire to one. He worked in a warehouse where his mother had gotten him a job many years ago through her connections. Carol tried many things. She even worked at school. But since the girl was adamantly opposed to the system that killed children in schools, she didn't last long there. If someone had told me that I would just waste 5 years of my life, she sighed and put the book aside, I wouldn't have studied anywhere at all. You can learn everything online now. As a child, Carol loved inventing things. Her father taught high school drafting and her mother worked as a doctor. Her parents decided that engineering education would suit Carol, and the girl herself entered the institute with high hopes. Carol dreamed of getting some experience and entering graduate school in a big city, but she quickly had to come back down to earth. She didn't want to stay to teach at the institute. She was interested in practicing. But her parents didn't have the money for her to go where the research centers were located, and counting on a grant at her own institute was pointless because of the low salaries of teachers for many years. In the end, never having become an inventor, she sat in a stall and did not understand what to do next. After a 15 job at the store, Carol found a rather promising place. Of course, the salary wasn't great, but the 8-to-4 schedule with Sunday off suited her. Carol, Hi came from the other side of the window. How are you doing? Why are you so sad? Hi, Kyle, she sighed. What's there to be happy about? I'll probably never get out of this hole. But it depends on how you look at it, Carol's former classmate replied seriously. The glass is half full or empty. That's something only you can determine. Sometimes Carol envied Kyle. He was a head saint in high school, too. His family was very poor. His alcoholic father had drained his mother until he died. And in 11th grade, the kid's mother fell and was left disabled. Kyle's 2 older sisters left for more promising places, and he stayed to look after Elena Alexeyevna. Kyle, like a mom, thoughtfully asked Carol, "Take her a visitor." "You will." "Thank you." He took his bread and a small package from Carol. "Let's keep our spirits up, or you'll find happiness around the corner and you won't be ready for it." "I wish to God I could say that," sighed her classmate. "I'll probably be carried out of this stall." The meeting with Constantine upset Carol even more, and beat, and so forever. But even earlier, Carol decided for the umpteenth time to talk to her husband today. She was sure he wouldn't agree to move from here to somewhere else. Still, the woman decided to give it a try. "What do I want?" she asked herself aloud. "But I'll start with a simple one. Do I want a lot of money?" Unequivocally, no. I want enough so that I don't have to think about not having a penny for bread in a week. I do not need an expensive car or a palace in principle. I need money as a tool for living. not for power and manipulating others. Let's move on. Family. I want children madly. I don't think there's any point in dragging it out any longer. Daniel and I have been married for about 5 years now. We've had enough to live for ourselves. The more Carol reasoned, the more she felt that her problem wasn't even the job. It was a matter of fulfillment. She was suffering from the fact that she couldn't find herself on the outside. Carol saw that she was not living her life. She wasn't realizing her potential at all. It's your own fault, her mother-in-law often reprimanded her. If you'd worked at school, everything would have been fine. But no, everyone's happy, but you're not. You're special. Carol put the book aside and surfed the internet again. She loved videos about cold core, single crystal synthesis, and other things that were recognized as pseudoscience. Although it had been proven more than once that it all worked in practice, people's consciousness hadn't yet reached those types of energy. If only we had such a device, we wouldn't need to build dangerous nuclear power plants. A little box in every yard and everyone would have electricity, Carol whispered, and began to draw something on the paper. Give me 2 bottles of Budweiser beer. Carol's slightly gruff voice brought Carol back to her senses. She handed over the bread, smiled crookedly. She didn't feel like saying anything back when the bread was already cheaper. The man didn't wait for the saleswoman's reaction and went into action himself. You've got a nerve, all their own. And bread costs as much as abroad. Carol shrugged her shoulders. She didn't want to get into a discussion. She couldn't influence the pricing in any way. And it was not only pointless, but even dangerous to take all the blame. The customer left, but Carol's mood had completely soured. She started to go home. It was an hour before the stall closed. Carol felt sad again. She dialed her husband. "Hi. How are you doing?" she asked Daniel. "Will you be there today as usual?" "No, I'll be late, maybe a couple hours," he sighed. "There's a shipment coming in late today, and we have to take it in." Carol wasn't in much of a mood to go home. Everything was boring. If she could get away from this life, she'd do it. Tangled in her coat. Despite the wind, she still decided to walk. The beginning of April was cold. There was still snow in some places. Carol walked toward the river. Her hands were cold, but for some reason she was drawn there. The woman approached the bank. Carol suddenly shuddered. "Are you doing something?" Glaring at him with her eyes. "Thinking," he answered calmly. "See," he pointed with his hand at the ice. "Why does it float?" "Well, because water expands when it freezes and becomes lighter." Carol answered at once. "Why does it expand?" He sighed. "No one knows. No one has been able to see how water molecules rearrange themselves into a crystalline structure. Just a moment, and the water in front of us is no longer water, but ice." "Is this a matter of life and death for you?" Carol tried to make a joke. "Yes," Kyle answered seriously. "I've been working on an invention for several years now. I want to create a substance that would restore the structure of Mom's hip bone." "What does ice have to do with it?" Carol couldn't understand. "You want to put it on the sore spot?" "No, I want a liquid that can expand when it hits the bone tissue, and thus create a porous bone structure. After my mom's fracture, all of her bones are flattened." "Honestly, I can't even imagine how that would be possible," Carol thought. "If you inject this fluid into the muscle, the body temperature will prevent it from changing structure. Therefore, this fluid in its original state must exist at a higher temperature." His eyes lit up. "I've already gotten it, but I don't have time to inject it yet. It's already getting viscous in the syringe." "You amaze me," Carol whispered in amazement. "But I still don't understand how it can be done." "The idea is this: I inject a certain substance, and at body temperature it becomes viscous and expands. I need to inject it near the problem bone. Then this substance will lift the bone tissue a little bit and keep it that way for a certain period of time. The bone tissue regenerates quickly, and a new healthy area appears. About a week to 2 weeks later, the substance breaks down into water and other safe elements. But if you look at it all theoretically, Carol lit up, then you need an inhibitor to slow down the solidification of this substance ahead of time. Although I still don't believe it can be done. The conversation with Kyle was a real jolt to the woman. What Kyle was doing seemed more miraculous than real to her. But let's say such a substance existed and could be administered. She pondered on the way home. How would it determine that it needed to work on bone and not other tissue? Carol got home and began to do her chores. But Kyle and his idea never left her mind. She was grasping at it like a straw, you might say. It had been so long since Carol's mind had solved such complex problems that the woman had taken a keen interest in the whole thing. Late in the afternoon, her husband returned. Carol's eyes were burning. She wanted to tell him everything. "Daniel, do you remember my classmate Kyle?" She spoke quickly. "Well, he's doing something so interesting right now. He wants to invent a drug to cure his mother." What a load of crap. Daniel made a disgruntled face. He's had her for over 10 years with a fractured femoral neck. "People can't get up. She's gonna die, you idiot." Why is he an idiot? The wife took offense. Maybe he can do something. Many inventions were created by amateurs, not professionals. Because he's an idiot. The man said unkindly, "I've seen your Kyle. It's written all over his face that he's a worthless man." "I don't agree with you," the wife countered. "Kyle doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke, he works. He's a decent man." "He's lazy." Daniel waved his hand. "Don't spoil the mood. I don't want to talk about this garbage." Daniel sat down at the table. Not that Daniel was any different from anyone else, but in his mind he was a real man. Of course, everyone in the neighborhood knew that Kyle was taking care of his mother. Many people found such things surprising, but didn't like it. Daniel himself had also lived across town with his mother before he got married. Carol and Daniel were able to buy a home inexpensively in this area of town that was considered the most up and coming. "Daniel, let's go somewhere else." Carol couldn't take it anymore. "I can't live here anymore." "I'm not leaving my mother, I warned you right away," he replied. "Maybe she'll move in with us later too." Carol tried again. "No, she wants to stay here." And Carol, "Well, don't you start. Go to work at the school, and your ardor will diminish immediately." In the beginning of their acquaintance, Carol felt like she was behind Daniel like a stone wall. But after a few years, she began to notice that her husband was not inclined to talk openly or to change. He was a very closed, conservative man, even though he didn't realize it. Carol suffered greatly from this. She could be called sociable, and at first the girl was sure that she could find a common language with Daniel. But time showed that she wouldn't. "Okay, Daniel, if you don't want to leave here, then let's plan a baby. Where else can we wait?" she raged. "That's something you and I will discuss later," he replied coldly. "Carol, will you let me have a quiet evening? I'm tired." There was nothing left for Carol to do but forget everything and do some business. How often do young people fall in love? They think their love will last forever. But time passes, and both begin to notice that they have not chosen the most suitable partner. And it becomes scary. Why is it so? Everything was great in the beginning. Unfortunately, each of us enters marriage not with a real person, but with our own expectations. So when our expectations are not met, we begin to see our partner as he or she really is. And of course, the reality is very different from the desired reality. Someone begins to work on himself, and the relationship improves, or people break up. But such a minority. The rest try their best to maintain the standards imposed on them and go on with their lives. That's what Carol thought, that now she would have to die with Daniel on the same day. Carol went to sleep again, such an impenetrable darkness enveloping her. She cast a glance at her husband and shuddered. He seemed foreign and distant to her. The next day was warmer. Carol didn't even turn on the heater. It began as it always did, first the receiving of goods, and then the customers crowded around her stall. Carol tried to smile at them, but she wasn't in the mood. She saw a picture in front of her that she had taken a wrong turn. Her parents didn't get involved in her daughter's life, and she couldn't talk to them. They, too, held views that were considered normal in society. By the end of the day, Carol realized that she was dying to talk to Kyle. But he was coming in every other day for bread. He wasn't officially working anywhere. He couldn't leave his mother all day. He worked part-time, did odd jobs, hired out to neighbors. None of his older sisters wanted to take on such a burden. So the man got by as best he could. The phone rang. Daniel said he was staying at his mother's house tonight. Carol knew the routine very well. Daniel had a difficult temper. He couldn't calm down for a long time, so after such conversations with his wife, he often spent the night at his mother's house, so as not to bring the matter to conflict. Perhaps it was Carol's own fault. If she caught fire, she couldn't stop until she got some result. And since it seemed to the woman that her happiness depended on moving to another city, or having a baby, she wanted to see this through to the end. "All right," the wife replied through tears. "Daniel," she wanted to say something to him, but refrained. "I'll miss you." It had been a lonely evening. It drove Carol further into a state of hopelessness. She felt like tearing up and throwing up. Maybe get a job in the area. An idea came to her mind. I won't be able to take it anytime soon. Daniel will never leave his mother. Daniel's father had died a year and a half ago. Now he was all the more reluctant to even think about another city. He was fine here. His mother was alone and needed looking after. Only unlike Kyle, Daniel felt like he was acting like a grown man. "I'm doing something wrong," Carol sighed. "It's like I'm walking in a vicious circle. There's no way out." It seemed she saw a dead end in every area of her life. The only thing that occurred to her then was to take a few days off for a few days off for a few days and just not think about anything. The next day was Friday, and the woman called the landlord first thing in the morning. He agreed to give her a couple days. Carol rejoiced when she saw her classmate. "But how are you doing? How are your experiments going?" "Well, some things are," he reported cheerfully. "Honestly, there isn't enough time." "I'd so like to see it," Carol admitted. "I can't believe it's possible. How does this substance reach the bone?" "Hey, I certainly don't understand it myself," the man shrugged. "It's just that if it stays in the tissue, it starts breaking down right away. I did experiments on my dog. Rex ran outside one night. He was mauled by other dogs. After some time, I tried to inject him near the sore spot, but there was no result. He healed all by himself." "Then why do you think it works on bone tissue?" The classmate couldn't figure it out. "And that's where the same Rex helped me again," laughed the man. "Only now that restless dog was being pounded by someone. Anyway, he came back with a broken paw. I gave him shots, didn't even think anything would work. But to my surprise, after 3 days he could walk. I touched his leg and the bone had fused. I gave him another injection, and within a week he was running like before. I don't have lab equipment, so I can't tell you exactly how it all works. But right now it seems to me that this substance first expands the bone tissue and then absorbs into it, promoting regeneration. You want to come over and I'll show you?" Kyle offered and started to pay because a couple more people came up behind him. "Are you going to be home tomorrow?" Carol shouted out from the stall. Kyle nodded affirmatively and waved at her. "Despite the problems, I find Kyle's life much more interesting than mine." Carol sighed and began serving customers, and there was something about it all. Perhaps Carol's passion for scientific knowledge, an interest in learning something new. But she did go to Kyle's house the next day. Carol talked to her classmate's mother. She had seen her years ago, and it was obvious now how much the woman was suffering. Kyle dressed her, taking her for a walk outside. "So, shall we go see it?" He winked cheerfully at his guest. I'll warn you right away, my place is a mess. They entered the workshop. Yes, it was a place of sheer chaos, but it made Carol's blood boil. How happy was she to see all those scattered tools, flasks, coasters, checks, bits of different metals. Wow, her eyes lit up. Kyle, you've got a real lab in here. I'm the one with the mess right now. And when I start the process, it's sterile clean here on the table. The man led her over to a very strange setup. There were some tubes connected there, vessels through which some kind of gas was apparently being pumped. And how does all this work, she asked in amazement. Is it something organic? Well, of course, no hydrocarbons around here. Kyle smiled and began to explain to Carol how his device worked. But that was only the first part. The main part was the substance it produced. That was where all the value was. Have you tried injecting your mom with it yet? Carol asked cautiously. Carol was afraid. I'm scared too, he sighed. He had recently picked up 2 stray dogs with broken paws. So now I'm treating them. Wow, caught her guest's breath. It's working. She kept her eyes on her host. Yes, he sighed. But I want to add one more component. My intuition tells me the effectiveness might increase that way. Kyle, have you told your mom about your experiments? Carol inquired. She wants to try it, he replied seriously. Mom is already very tired of her disability. I feel very sorry for her, too. Yes, the case is too delicate. There are great risks. Little chance of anything? Maybe such a drug would work for dogs, but not for humans, sighed a classmate. That's the problem, Kyle supported her. It's not like I'm a scientist. I don't have that kind of knowledge. Sure, I've reread tons of books, even consulted with some experts. But I can't say out loud that it works. Kyle. Well, if it does work, what then? Curiosity was shared by Carol. But I'm not Henry Ford. I don't have a wife, Clara, who supported him no matter what. And the light saw the world's first automobile, the man sighed. But if it does come out that way, I'll be happy for those people who will have the opportunity to have real bones instead of titanium bones. So what? A lot of handicapped people will walk normally. Carol walked home. She wanted to cry and rejoice at the same time. Why cry? Because people like Kyle never asked for anything from anyone. They were altruistic and tried to bring something to people at the expense of themselves. Well, joy was a natural feeling from the fact that among the heart-centered people were these fools like her classmate. Daniel and his kind would never put such simpletons in line with themselves. It would be beneath their dignity. But it was Kyle, not him, who sought to improve the lives of all mankind. He used his last dime to buy the necessary drugs, assembling rig after rig until he got exactly what he wanted. These are the kind of people who just move science forward. They're real men with pumped-up brains, not bodies. The latter didn't matter much, except for the physical labor. There were many, many things going through Carol's mind. She, too, wanted to quit everything and do something, to invest her energies, to dream that something would work out, instead of sitting in her stall and being angry at life. Carol was in no mood at all, so she didn't call her husband. She felt a strong resentment toward him. Compared to Kyle, he looked retarded. His outlook on life showed that he didn't have much intelligence in him. She distracted herself with household chores. Her husband came home from work in the evening. He was kind of wooden. Daniel, is something wrong? His wife walked up to him. You look exhausted. Yeah, there was trouble at work today, he tossed off and went into the other room. Carol didn't bother to bother him, but there was pain in her soul again. Daniel seemed like a complete stranger to her. The weekend flew by quickly and Carol went back to work. The morning didn't go well. First, some grandfather got into a fight with her, always telling her that she'd stolen from him. In his opinion, she should have taken half as much bread from him. "Grandpa, do I have to add the rest of you out of my own pocket?" Carol answered him. "You're smoking everyone here," yelled an old man outside the stall. "Whatever price you want, that's what you charge." "Old age is no fun," said an elderly woman nearby. "It takes away everything, even your mind." The grandfather kept yelling, threatening to report him to the police when the saleswoman stopped paying attention to him. "Hello, Carol," the longtime acquaintance approached the stall with a wry smile. She had no idea how much Carol hated her, and the feeling was mutual. "Hello, Lucy," the woman replied calmly. As always, she did not want to prolong the conversation. She and Lucy had once worked together at the school. The latter stayed there, worked her way up to head teacher, and thought she had become a celestial. Well, since Carol was openly opposed to the school system, she was laughed at by the likes of Lucy. They made a good profit at the school, with some of the curtain money going into their pockets. And the rates for expensive gifts were set at the beginning of the school year. "I heard you and Daniel divorced." Lucy lowered her voice. "Why were they so out of character?" "What the hell is that?" Carol's eyes flashed. "We're fine, we're still together. But that chick he keeps driving around in his car is nothing like you." Lucy laughed out loud. "I heard it was someone from his work. It's not like his mom gave him a girl." "Is there anything else you need? Or is that it?" Carol tossed it to her. "Sorry, I got a lot of work to do." "Yeah," she said dismissively. "The truth hurts." She grabbed the bag of muffins and walked away. Of course, Lucy's words had hurt Carol. She trusted her husband. Yes, he was occasionally late for work, but that didn't mean anything. "Idiot," Carol whispered. "You'd better look at yourself. Stolen money. Daddy's pockets are howling." No matter how much Carol urged herself not to think about the incident, all sorts of thoughts popped into her head. Meanwhile, Daniel was having a serious conversation. It was break time, and he went into the back room to see Lenora. The woman pretended not to pay attention to him. Daniel approached her, wanting to hug her. "Don't touch me." She waved him away. "I told you it's over between us." "Len, stop it." "I love you," he said in a gentle voice. "I broke up with my ex," she sobbed. "Are you still living with her?" "I just don't know how to file for divorce so that I can get the house back. I paid the loan on it," the man sighed. "You wouldn't even listen to me yesterday," Lenora said. "I don't care, the mistress didn't want to reconcile. You promised me that she wouldn't be in my life anymore." She sobbed. "I can tell you that again," he confirmed. "You give me time." When Daniel had met Carol, he'd thought he'd found his ideal. The girl seemed smart, reliable. Of course, the young man had serious relationships before her, but he had not yet decided to marry. Daniel always considered himself one of the most real men. When he was young, he enthusiastically pumped his muscles. In his opinion, he wasn't stupid either. In short, the perfect man. After a year of married life, Carol and her high-mindedness began to annoy him. Daniel didn't want to waste his time with such nonsense. All this talk about life, about how to make it better for everyone. It wasn't for him. Well, and then, about 3 years later, when Carol had developed a bent on moving to the city, the young man finally realized that he'd done something wrong. It wasn't Daniel's policy to admit his mistakes. A real man couldn't make mistakes. But a couple more months passed, and Daniel clearly realized that something had to be done. He'd had his eye on one at work a long time ago. Lenora was living with Wade at the time. She was a beautiful and hard-working woman, so Daniel began to pursue her. They hid at first. Daniel had a car, so it was easy. Then Daniel started making jealous scenes to get his lover to break up with her roommate. Basically nothing new. A word or two about Daniel's mother. It's not that Tracy hated Carol. No, it's just that she'd always felt she was the wrong kind of wife for Daniel. Carol wasn't exactly a looker. Her overly skinny body and salt black hair didn't evoke the emotions that usually came from seeing a beautiful woman. And when Tracy learned that her son was looking at Lenora, she didn't mind at all. Carol's fate had been decided behind her back. She'd hoped she and her husband would go to the big city and have children. Lenora clung to her lover, wanting certainty. And for that, Daniel had to go through with the divorce. The sooner the better. The man himself couldn't stand his wife anymore either. She had become repugnant to him. Daniel, in the evening, Carol came up to him and said, "I want to talk to you." She was very worried. "Not tonight," he objected immediately. "Carol, may I? Did you get any sleep tonight? I still can't get over last night." "Daniel, I can't take it anymore," she shouted. "You're not paying attention to me. What's the matter?" "It's nothing," he threw coldly. "I'm tired. It's not like I'm a robot. I can't take a day off on a whim like you do." "Do you love me?" the wife asked provocatively. "Carol, answer me. Did you decide to finish me off today?" After all, jumped the husband out of bed and began to dress. "Where are you going?" Carol rushed to him in tears. "To my mother's, at least to sleep at her place. She doesn't nag me as much as you do." He said goodbye and disappeared into the yard. During the night, Carol was restless. The next day in the evening, she decided to drive to her husband's work. She waited till morning. It was gray, unkind. The work was hard. There weren't many people because it was raining. Carol closed her stall and hailed a cab. She tangled herself in her raincoat and waited. Daniel worked until 6. His wife waited for him, stood nearby and watched as her husband came out of the gate, followed by some strange woman. She sat in the front seat and began kissing him passionately. Carol couldn't move. She sat down and cried loudly. The car had long since left and she still couldn't get up. "Daniel," she called her husband an hour later, "we need to have a serious talk with you. I've seen you. So stop making a fool of me." Her husband was silent, disconnecting the phone. Carol tried many more times to dial him, but he blocked her number. "Bastard," Carol screamed. "What a coward you turned out to be. You've never been a real man, only lip service, just shaking your muscles senselessly." Carol was exhausted that night. She hadn't slept much the night before to do anything about it. She took a sedative, fell asleep. She woke up to the phone ringing, her alarm clock going off. She could barely get up. No sooner had she opened her stall than Kyle came rushing toward her on his bike. He looked very excited. "Carol, I did it," he said. "I gave Mom her first shot, and she's feeling better." "Congratulations," she said dryly. She was in so much pain she didn't want to see anyone. "Did something happen to you?" Carol's classmate tossed his bike. "It's nothing much," she said through tears. "It's just that I'm going to be filing for divorce." "Did you and Daniel have a fight?" As if he wanted to be supportive of his friend. "Carol, I can help you with that." "Kyle? With what?" She covered her face with her hands. "Will you make me forget that he has a mistress and that he cheated on me? Here you go, give this to your mom." She held out some buns in a bag. "Come over tonight after work," Kyle suggested. "You need a detached look at all this." Carol didn't say anything back to him, shrugging her shoulders. She just wanted to stop living at that moment. Daniel still didn't answer either. Carol called her parents, explaining everything to them. "Carol, get your things and come and visit us," her mother told her immediately. "How I didn't want your Daniel. He thought too highly of himself." And so he was. Not a man, but a wimp. Can't even admit his betrayal. And Daniel was actually very nervous. That was the real reason he hadn't filed for divorce yet. He didn't want to be seen as a scumbag in other people's eyes. But how to frame his wife? He hadn't figured it out until now. Now everyone would know he had a mistress. At work, they'd somehow managed to keep it quiet until the last moment. Daniel's mother had made up a legend that Lenora was a distant relative of theirs, and so Daniel often gave her a ride home. They never took liberties in public at the warehouse, and they rarely spoke at all. So from this side, Daniel looked like a decent family man and took care of his relatives. Tracy was often late for work. Then the three of them would drive home. Daniel swore the last words at Carol to himself. He really didn't want the gossip. Everything was going according to plan. His mother had promised to help him get rid of his wife. Carol seemed to feel her husband cursing her. She walked toward the house, but then abruptly turned around and headed to visit Kyle. Carol greeted her classmate's mother cheerfully. "It's so good to see you." The guest froze in place. She couldn't believe her eyes. No, Lenora wasn't walking yet, but she looked much better. "Can you imagine? The pains are gone," she reported contentedly. "I was so scared, and Kyle was too." "Carol, but what have I got to lose? 5 more years of being in a wheelchair and then going to the other side of the world. I'm still afraid to believe in that miracle." Carol and Kyle walked to the workshop. The man sat down in a chair. He was overwhelmed with emotion, such joy that he couldn't even express it. "Carol, I consulted someone," Kyle began. "True, it's not a doctor, it's a biochemist. But anyway, he told me it's a very promising field. Something like growing bones, only not from stem cells, but from the cells of the bone itself. First, this substance fills the problematic joint. Then it expands the space a little bit and starts to fit into it. This somehow provokes the growth of new cells. I don't even know how to explain it scientifically." "Do you want to continue your experiment?" Carol inquired. "Carol, it seems very promising to me. I'd have to get my mother back on her feet," he sighed. "Serious research takes money, and I don't have any. I'm already denying myself everything to buy everything I need. I even needed high-grade gold for the rig." "But if you get a patent," Carol suggested, "then you could implement your invention." "Who's going to give it to me? That takes serious research, not knee-jerk like mine, if I could find sponsors. But in our city, it is simply impossible. We either have beggars like me or businessmen in the market. And these comrades are not interested in their future anyway. They don't even want a better life for their children. They live for one day, just to make more money." And yet Carol had the feeling that something would change. She returned home in high spirits. She felt like her life was making sense to her now. Carol was eager to study with Kyle, and the first thing she wanted to do was contact someone at her institute for advice. One faculty member she had once been good friends with, but that would come later. For now, the woman needed to pack her things and move in with her parents. Carol saw that her husband wasn't home. She rushed into one of the rooms and started packing her bags. The pain came over her again, and she dropped everything and lay down on the bed to calm down. Then she heard a noise. She threw her bag into the closet and hid in the corner behind the curtain. She didn't want to see Daniel so badly that some childish instinct kicked in. Someone was talking at the door, and Carol immediately recognized her mother-in-law and her husband. "Just throw my jewelry in her drawer," Tracy was saying. "And then I'll file a police report. Let them know I suspect her. Your wife turned out to be a thief. I mean, she's been visiting me, and everyone knows it." Carol opened the door, turned on the recording on her phone. The husband and mother-in-law were so startled they couldn't get a word out. "So that's it," Carol angrily threw. "Not only did you scoundrels confuse me, but you also wanted to slander me. But no more. Listen here. Everyone will know what you are and what your son is, and he's no different from you. He's a bastard like you." "Shut your mouth," Daniel lunged at her. "I'll have you now." He swung around. "Everything that happens here is seen by Kyle on his phone. He bugged me." Carol made up a story as she went along. "So any movement you make in the police will be right there." Daniel ran out of the house, followed by his mother. Carol, of course, hadn't heard that Tracy wasn't going to have her son share the house with her, as that was a topic they had discussed before the jewelry was planted. Her mother-in-law's jewelry would become a tool for their blackmail. Carol would then easily give up her share. Daniel thus accomplished two things at once. He got out clean, because now Carol was to blame for the divorce. And secondly, he was taking all the property. He pulled up sharply in front of his mother's yard. She got out and he drove to his mistress. "How I hate you so much," he whispered. "Stupid, you ruined everything." He pounded his fist on the steering wheel. Daniel stepped on the gas. He only had a couple of kilometers to go to get to Lenore. A corner appeared, and Daniel suddenly slammed into a pole at full speed. The car was a pile of metal in an instant. Everything swirled before Daniel's eyes and he lost consciousness. No, screamed Tracy Alexandra as her son was overtaken by instant punishment. She walked around with crazy eyes and told everyone how her daughter-in-law had cast a spell on her and Daniel. She wanted to kill him, found a lover, and thought to get rid of my boy that way. How are such people incapable of admitting their guilt? And Tracy Alexandra has always been convinced of her uniqueness. Mistakes are for the weak. That's how she raised her son. He could look down on everyone forever, make fun of others. But there's always a price. Daniel came to. His mother was sitting beside him, crying. She had already argued with all the doctors, demanding that her son be brought back to life, though she had been warned that if Daniel did regain consciousness, he would most likely remain disabled. I mean, how's that no walking? Tracy Alexander jumped up from her chair in the doctor's office. It's your responsibility to get him on his feet. But I'm not the Lord God, replied the doctor. Besides, you can arrange in New York for money to have him operated on. We don't do such complicated operations in our city. There are no such specialists. So it's up to you. Tracy Alexander shouted at the entire hospital, threatening the prosecutor's office. Come on, bring the prosecutor. I'll show him in what conditions we work. Maybe they will at least raise our salaries. Calmly replied the doctor. Tracy Alexandra was shaking, but she didn't realize that the doctors had already done everything they could. Daniel had survived, and already that could be called a miracle. After a few days, they allowed his mistress to visit the patient. She cried, and then decided to talk to the doctor. Are you sure that nothing can be done? I beg you, maybe we can find some kind of cure. Unfortunately, there is no such magic pill, the doctor sighed. Prepare for the worst. He won't walk. He has serious problems with his spine. The mistress fell to the floor. She hadn't counted on this outcome at all. Lenora found herself in a very difficult position. For almost a week she thought about her future, and then she made a decision. Wade. Hi, she dialed her ex-boyfriend. I'm so sorry, Lenora cried, fake tears. I only love you. Let's get back together. Tracy Alexandra was also thinking hard. She was counting on Lenora in this situation. Daniel would get the house and the divorce. So they already had a place to live, she reasoned. I would visit them from time to time, help her out. The next day at Tracy's work, Alexandra wanted to have a serious talk with Daniel's mistress. Lenora, can I talk to you for a minute? She approached her. My girl, I don't think you're going to have any more problems with housing. You and Daniel can stay at his place or yours. It's just that if you take him in, you can sell the house and pay for the treatment. The doctor said he might get his back working and my boy will at least be able to ride in a wheelchair. Lenora laughed. Tracy Alexandra, you'll have to excuse me, but I can't. Somehow going pale, break Daniel. Lenora, are you abandoning my son? I mean, he loves you so much. Tracy Alexandra. You see, Wade came back to me, she smiled crookedly. So we're living together now. You took him back, Tracy Alexandra whispered. Lenora, how could you do that? And my boy. She sobbed. But Lenora wasn't about to change her plans. As long as Daniel had been healthy, everything had been fine. But now that he was an invalid, why would she want to ruin her life? Loving someone else is important, of course. But you can't love yourself any less. It's always me that comes first for people like Lenora. It was very hard for Tracy Alexandra to admit defeat. Things had spiraled so fast she'd forgotten all about her sister-in-law. But it was getting to her. The few times she'd gotten to Daniel's house, his wife hadn't been home. What am I going to tell her? Tracy Alexandra was working out a plan in her head. It's not like she's going to listen to me. I have to come up with something so she can't say no to me. The mother drove to her son's house almost every day. She was tired of running back and forth. "Mom, why isn't Lenora coming?" Daniel asked her one day. "Why don't you ask her to come over and see me? I miss her." "Daniel," she said as gently as possible. "Do you understand? And Lenora's gone. Her mom's sick, so she has to live in the village for now." Tracy Alexandra realized that she couldn't tell Daniel yet that Lenora had left him. It might make things worse for him. "Mom, call her," he asked. "Please. I want to hear her voice so badly." Tracy Alexandra was confused. She left the room and dialed Lenora. "I'm begging you." "Well, play along with him," she cried. "If he finds out now that you left him, God forbid." "Well, okay, I'll say a few words to him, and that's it," the ex-lover replied angrily. "If Wade finds out, he'll kill me." Lenora wasn't as affectionate as she'd been before. But Daniel was somewhat relieved. "Mom, did you see her?" His face turned contemptuous. "I don't even want to bring her up, but we need to settle on a house. I think I'll be divorced easily now. I'll probably recover for another 6 months, and then I'll go back to work." My mother didn't say anything. She knew that it would be impossible to realize all his dreams. "Okay, I'll talk to her," she sighed. "Daniel, let's talk about this later, after you've been discharged." Tracy Alexandra urgently needed to get Carol back. Hanging her disabled son around her neck was not for her. In words alone, Tracy Alexandra could be the perfect mother, but spending the rest of her old age caring for a sick person was too much. Carol was screaming all over the house. She couldn't take it anymore. She'd never met such mean people before. She was putting her things in a bag. In fact, Carol was in such an agitated state that she could not control herself. Finally, her hysteria ended and tears were shed. After that, the woman felt lighter. "I hate it," she whispered. Carol carried some bags outside and hailed a cab. Her mother had already called several times. She was frantically worried about her daughter. No sooner had Carol laid out her things than she was called. "Yes," she said angrily. She had no time to talk. The phone interrogated her first and last name. "Your husband was in an accident?" She was suddenly informed. "He's in intensive care. The chances are slim." Carol was numb. She couldn't even believe what she was hearing at first. "Mom, he was in an accident," she said quietly, and rushed over to her. Of course, Carol was very angry with Daniel, but she didn't wish him dead. "Are you going to go to him?" Mom asked. Her daughter immediately shook her head negatively. "Mom, what's the point of all this? He doesn't love me. He has a mistress. Let her worry about him." Carol wiped away her tears. Be that as it may, Carol still wanted to visit her husband, but she held herself in check. Why? She was talking to someone in her head. If he doesn't want me, she still had feelings for Daniel, and Carol couldn't hide it. But in the situation they were all in, her coming would have looked just plain stupid even in her own eyes. She had to deal with her feelings on her own. Still, she'd talked to Daniel's doctor. She drove to the hospital early one morning before work. "He'll remain disabled," the doctor said. "How's the verdict?" "Unfortunately, there is serious damage to his spine." Since Carol now lived far from where she worked, she, like many in her town, rode her bicycle. Hi, Kyle rode up to her. Carol, come see us if you can. Really need your advice, Carol. Daniel's been in an accident, she couldn't stand it and cried. He's going to be an invalid now. You're going back to him now, consternation showed on Kyle's face. Carol noticed how his voice trembled. No, she shook her head negatively. He has another woman, and he doesn't care about me at all. The man picked up the bread and pastries and went about his business. Carol watched him go. Yes, the old jacket Kyle seemed to have worn as a teenager, the shoes with holes in them. As a classmate had told her, he didn't spend the money from his mother's pension, and that's what they lived on. And whatever he managed to earn or sell, he put into his rig. Why is that? Carol sighed. Those who live only for themselves prosper, and those who do their best for others are dragging out a miserable existence in poverty like this. Despite the pain, Carol decided to go out and accept her friend's invitation. It had been almost 2 weeks since Kyle had first administered the medicine to her mother. They hadn't seen each other much since then. Kyle said he had been very busy with work the whole time. Carol walked into her friend's house. He was smiling. It was obvious that he knew about something, and the guests obviously had no idea about it. The woman entered the room and froze in place. Standing by the window was Kyle's mother on crutches. God, how is this possible? She whispered. Come out. Kyle walked toward her. Amber Adams demonstrated a few tentative steps. Carol looked at Kyle in bewilderment. Is this a joke? She was overwhelmed with emotion. Kyle, you can't believe it. It's true. He walked over to his mother and hugged her. Well, I'll tell you honestly, if Mom recovers, we'll certainly lose something, he laughed. But I'm willing to work and compensate Mom for her pension. I'll go to work myself. If I move normally, right away, the woman replied. For so many years, I don't want to sit any longer. The young people chatted till nearly 3 o'clock. This event was a big deal to both of them. Then Kyle walked Carol home. Or rather, they rode their bikes home together. And then he came home. Carol went to bed. She thought about the patience and stamina it took not to break down like that. And Kyle, he said, had been failing for years. He'd quit for a couple months, and then, it would be like an impulse from inside him to get up. He'd get back on track, her friend told her. Carol herself felt that now that she was free, she could do something useful. She would really like to support Kyle first. If I could find someone interested. She sighed. Then Kyle would have a chance at life. If he paid good money for the patent, it could be enough for him for years to come. Maybe someone else would invest in the invention. He had so many ideas. But again, it all came down to finances. The teacher Carol contacted told her right away that government organizations were unlikely to be interested in such a thing. They wanted everything for free. So you have to look for someone from serious businessmen. And where will you find them, these businessmen? She whispered frustratedly. It's one thing to be in New York, but it's another to be in a province like this. The next day prepared new adventures for Carol. Around 10, Tracy's mother-in-law, Alexandra, approached her stall. Panting with anger, Carol tried to be as friendly as possible. We could talk to you, she smiled for emphasis. Carol thought it would be about the divorce or the division of the apartment, since those were still open to her. So she agreed. There were no visitors, and the woman stepped outside. She crossed her arms over her chest and waited. Carol, her mother-in-law, sighed. You misunderstood us last time. You see, she seduced my son. It was obvious she was struggling with every word. Anyway, she's been blackmailing him, threatening Daniel. She's got some man. I'm pretty sure he's the one who beat up my son 3 days before that accident. Lenora stated that if Daniel didn't bring her gold jewelry as a gift, Tracy Alexandra held her handkerchief to her mouth. My son would be stabbed to death. We wanted to make it look like you had my jewelry that she wanted. like you'd taken it. Carol clearly sensed that her mother-in-law was trying to put her in a state of pity for her and Daniel. She even began to sympathize with her husband. Emotions overwhelmed her and she stopped thinking rationally. "Okay, stop," she said to either herself or Tracy Alexandra. "Now, don't make a fool of me. I wonder how it's possible to blackmail a man into sleeping with someone. That can only happen by free will. Did she tie him up, rape him?" Tracy Alexandra was silent. She tried to catch a single sensible thought in her head, but she was having none of it. "Carol, but I'm begging you. You don't leave him. Daniel loves you very much. He keeps asking, when are you going to visit him? I'm begging you." Her mother-in-law was still looking at her. "But as far as I'm concerned, your son doesn't want a mistress." "And you do now," Carol laughed. "I'm always amazed at people like that. How can you be such a creature? I mean, you're nothing." How loudly you shouted, "My Daniel, what's the problem? So you look after him yourself." "Carol, well, you must realize that I'm not young anymore," she said in an angelic voice. "I don't have the strength to visit him." One thought occurred to Carol, and that would be the last thing she would do for him. Tracy Alexandra cheered up. She didn't understand what Carol was talking about then, and Carol wouldn't talk to her again. To her delight, people approached. Tracy Alexander almost sent her an air kiss out of joy. After work, Carol drove to Kyle's house. He was tinkering in the workshop as usual. Sitting on the bench was Amber Adams. She was happy, smiling, and greeted Carol. "Oh, look, I walked with crutches. Much better today," she said. Carol hugged her with delight. Kyle watched them from the sidelines. He was very pleased that his mother liked Carol. "Shall we go?" He waved to his guest. "There's something else I want to show you." "Kyle, could you help me?" Carol asked seriously. "Do you think your stuff could help Daniel?" "Well," he scratched his head, "I can't say for sure. But if you think about it theoretically, yes. I mean, Mom's bones are regenerating, and so are tendons and nerve connections." "Could you help him?" Carol looked hopefully into his eyes. "If he agrees." "All right," Kyle answered without much enthusiasm. "I'll do it for you." Carol didn't pay much attention to his last words. It wasn't that she wanted to go on living with Daniel, but she clearly felt that she had to give him the chance. "Thank you." Carol suddenly ran up to the man and kissed him on the cheek. Kyle blushed. He went out of his workshop under the pretense of taking something, rushed into his room, and collapsed on his bed. He was very afraid that someone might find out about his secret. "Well, are you ready?" After a minute, he entered the workshop again. "Carol, come on, look at this." He opened an old notebook with yellowed pages. "This is a plate that is supposed to generate special radiations. Its power is small, but unlike those that now exist, such radiation should deliver the drug to the bloodstream without any interference." "Are you saying that it is possible to somehow transfer the medicine into a vein without a syringe?" Carol opened her mouth in surprise, but Kyle was pleased with her reaction. "Carol, it's all about the radiation. It sort of takes the particles of any drug and delivers them to the right place. Rex has already experienced the benefits of this new method." Carol laughed. What was Oscar injecting him with? He was very pleased by the way Kyle laughed. "It's all about the plate. It requires a special alloy. Then I coated it several times with different liquids. I have another idea. But it would require special equipment, very thin plates of quartz with other materials layered on top of them. I definitely can't do that here. The plate that I have, so far, delivers only 50 to 60% of the drug. So that's a start, too." Carol looked at this thin, unremarkable man and marveled at his intelligence. He spoke so simply about such serious things, talking about his mistakes and unprofessionalism. "Kyle, you're a genius." Carol couldn't take it anymore. She kept her eyes on him. The man blushed. I don't know anything at all, he mumbled. There are such luminaries, I'm no match for them. You're wrong, he said, and that struck a nerve with her. I'm proud to have you as a friend, and I'm sure you'll accomplish a lot. I'd like to get my mom back on her feet, he said sadly. Of course, it's a miracle what's happening now. But I'd like to see her walking freely in the yard, growing her favorite flowers. Kyle, I want to get her something. Carol's eyes lit up. I'll bring her some seedlings and some flower seeds. I don't know anything about that, he smiled. I'd really appreciate it if you'd look into it. It was one of the best evenings they had ever had as friends. Kyle saw Carol off. Late. Carol, thank you. A friend said goodbye to her. I wouldn't have succeeded if it weren't for your support. I really appreciate it, he lowered his head. Kyle, you're a very good friend too, and I feel like you underestimate yourself, Carol replied. Carol touched his hair. Kyle got on his iron horse and rode toward home. His heart was singing. It was May outside. The next day, Carol wanted to go to her husband's house from work. Of course, there was great anger in her heart, but she realized that she would never take revenge, especially not if Kyle's drug could help him. There were no harmful substances in it. Any doctor would have said it wouldn't work. But as Kyle himself had said, it wasn't so much the composition that was the main thing here, but the process of getting it. Carol tossed the guests into her bag, got on her bike. She didn't know how she was going to talk to Daniel, or even if the dialogue would take place. Carol waited a moment to catch her breath. She went over in her head what she was going to say to her husband. She looked into the room, and there was nothing there. That was the most important thing. Carol really didn't want to meet her mother-in-law. And Daniel was awake. You could tell by the look on his face that he was thinking about something. Lenora had told him that she wouldn't be coming to see him in the next few months. Daniel got some kind of strange premonition. "What are you doing here?" he asked his wife in horror. His cheekbones shifted nervously. "Go away. I don't want to see you." "Daniel, let's talk to you," Carol said calmly. "We're adults." "This is all your fault. Is it your fault that I'm lying here right now?" Daniel accused his wife. "Daniel, come on. You know that's a lie." She tried to calm him down. "I can help you." He laughed to devalue Carol. "You've accomplished nothing in your life except your stall. Kyle invented a special drug that helps your bones get back to normal. It's perfectly safe," the wife began. "I don't want to hear about that quack. Although I'm not surprised you cheated on me with him. You're both assholes," Daniel shouted, drool flying from his mouth. "Get out, Tahir. I wish Kyle would die sooner. That penniless hobo on his prehistoric bicycle." "Daniel," he lifted his mother. "She's been in a wheelchair for years. This is your chance." Carol tried to ignore his profanity. "Go away," Daniel shouted, and his red face said he was in a very emotional state. A nurse came running in and asked her guest to leave. Carol saw Daniel turning his head from one side to the other and shouting something. "What did his pumped-up body give him?" sighed the wife. "His psyche is so weak that his muscles could never compensate for that loss." Carol was genuinely sorry that Daniel had refused her help. She realized that it was unlikely that his mother would mess around with him. She'd already hinted at it when they'd met. "It's his choice," Carol whispered. "I did the best I could. His accident wasn't my fault. I never cheated on him." 2 days later, Carol's mother-in-law came to work again. She was no longer asking her to go back to her son. "Carol, I think you need to take Daniel's situation seriously," she said. "I'm asking you to give him the house. I can't cure him on my own." "Okay," Carol agreed. "But on one condition, you'll never be in my life again." Tracy Alexandra agreed. After the tantrum her son had thrown at her about Carol, she had no more requests or complaints for her. When Daniel's mother started this game, she felt like a real queen. But every game comes to an end sooner or later. And the one who seemed at the beginning to have every chance to win, by the end of the game lost. Everyone had made their choice. Even the accident didn't break Daniel's pride. Who knows, maybe thanks to Kyle he could have stood up, but that would have been beyond the realm of dreams. Because men like Daniel would never reach out to men like Kyle. It's beneath their dignity. It was painful to recognize that Daniel's life had no value, as he lived only for himself. And such crazy romantics, dreamers who look like fools from the outside, are capable of moving mountains. And so ended the story of Carol and her husband. After that, the woman was never again interested in Daniel's life. He was rumored to be living with his mother. A few days later, Carol met with Kyle. The man gave her a very strange look. "So are you going to help him?" Breathlessly, he asked. For Kyle, you could say it was a matter of life and death. "No, he rejected our help," she smiled faintly. "Kyle, I don't want to talk about this anymore." "I'm all for it," he cheered. "Carol, Mom made her first cake today. She really wants you to come over for a visit." "Okay," she promised Kyle. "Tell her I'll be there." Kyle's invitation lifted her spirits. Carol worked through her day so effortlessly, as if she were being held above ground by some force. "You're glowing today," customers told her. "You're in a good mood." Carol nodded at them. She really did feel happy, as if a heavy weight had been lifted off her shoulders. The evening had been so wonderful that Carol didn't even want to go home. It seemed to her that this was where she belonged. They sat in the workshop after tea. Kyle stared at his guest. His lips moved as if he were saying something. "Carol," he said quietly. "I'm like, how do I say this?" The woman stepped closer to him and stroked his face with her hand. "I love you." Kyle finally said. "I love you too," she kissed him. "I want to be your muse." The woman whispered, "We'll do everything together. I'll help you with everything." "Thank you," he touched her hair. "Carol, I'm as lucky as Rex. I'll have not only a wife, but a friend and a companion." "I believe in you," Carol said. "You will succeed. Kyle, you're a genius. You have to admit it." "I'll try," he said timidly. "I'm not afraid of anything with you." The man breathed in the scent of her hair and couldn't believe he could be so happy. 7 years had passed. "Kyle, we're here," came from the backyard. "Are you home?" Carol headed toward her husband's huge workshop. On the way, she stopped and looked at the beautiful garden. She and Kyle had managed to find a sponsor back then, after all, and Kyle had made some very good money. They had bought a 2-story house with a large lot. Amber Adams was on the first floor. She ran the garden. Carol took care of the children, but most of the time they all spent together in the lab at Dad's house. Carol gave birth to a son almost a year after she registered. And when he turned 3, they had a yearling daughter and another boy. In general, as Carol predicted, Kyle became not only a scientist but also a caring father. And despite his crazy busy schedule, he made time for his children. Now, many years later, the man was again working on the development of non-contact administration of drugs by means of special radiation. There was a businessman who invested good money in his invention. And since Kyle couldn't live without his inventions, of course he agreed. Dad, his oldest son, ran into his workshop. "We're back." "Oh," I hadn't heard his father jumped up. "How was your vacation? Did you enjoy it?" "Yes. Grandma didn't even want to get out of the pool," Oscar laughed. Why did he open his mouth in curiosity? "I'll tell you all about it later." His father took him in his arms. "Let's go to Mommy first." Hi, her husband hugged Carol. "I see the kids are excited about the water park," he smiled. I don't know about the kids, but I sure am. Amber Adams laughed. I'll have something to tell you about tomorrow at work. I wish you could have come with us. Carol touched her husband's hair. Next time, I promise. He put his arm around her waist. But my muse, it's time to inspire me. Mom, there's something we need to discuss in the workshop. Could you watch the kids for half an hour? I promise I'll tell you all about it tonight. He smiled as the kids puffed up their cheeks. Amber Adams stared after them. She couldn't even believe that almost 7 years ago she'd been practically unconscious. And now, thanks to her son, she could not only live a full life but make up for lost time.